Hi guys, tonight I want to take you on a long and winding journey through a world most grim and strangely oddly peaceful in the telling. You see, history has its heroes and its monsters. But rarely do we take the time to reflect on the quieter evils, the subtle tragedies, the cold hands of men who were meant to be protectors yet became shadows over their own blood. In this story, we'll drift through the Middle Ages, visiting 24 tales of fathers, kings, knights, lords, and peasants whose children bore not pride in their name, but torment in their wake. These are the worst dads in medieval history. But remember, we are not here to judge. We are here to float alongside their stories, gently, softly, and maybe sleepily. Part 1. The first story begins not with violence, not with war, but with a library. The year is 1212. And we are in southern France, in a stone manor perched atop a windswept hill near the town of Albi. Inside the study, parchment scrolls are unfurled, flickering candlelight dances across Latin script, and the air is thick with incense and old dust. Here lives Guillaume de Montfort, a minor noble and a passionate theologian. He was a man who fancied himself a philosopher, though history might call him a fanatic. And tonight, we meet him not through his sermons or war stories, but through the frightened eyes of his 12-year-old daughter, Isabelle. Isabelle, a thin girl with large, alert eyes and soft copper curls, was raised mostly by the manor's old nursemaid. Her mother had died giving birth to a stillborn child when Isabelle was only 6, and since then, the castle had grown quieter and colder. Guillaume, once a boisterous presence in the halls, retreated into his beliefs. Albigensian Christianity, to be exact. Heretical to some, sacred to others, this faith would lead many to flame and many more to war. But for Isabelle, it meant silence. Long silences. Meals where no words were spoken. Days where the sound of a closing book was the only sign her father was even home. But Guillaume was no ordinary distant father. He believed with solemn conviction that the material world was a cage for the soul, and that children were born already tainted. Even his own daughter. Perhaps especially her. He would preach to her, not as a child but as a sinner. Her favourite book, a collection of fables about forest creatures, was burned one morning before her eyes, tossed into the hearth because the souls of beasts are of no concern to the pure. She was denied sweets, music, even laughter. Her dolls were buried in the garden under a small wooden cross. A soul must mourn the illusion of joy, he had said. But the worst came one winter, when Isabelle grew ill. Fevered, weak, coughing blood. The village healer was summoned, an old woman with herbs and quiet kindness. She applied poultices, whispered prayers over Isabelle's shaking body, and even sang softly to calm her. She stayed the night. And in the morning, Guillaume had her arrested by local clergy for witchcraft and temptation. Isabelle watched from the stairs as the woman was dragged out, pleading not for her life, but for the child's recovery. Isabelle survived the illness, barely. But something in her spirit changed. Not with fire or fury, but like the slow extinction of a candle left in the cold. She stopped speaking entirely for a time. She walked the halls barefoot, silent, eyes far away. Guillaume took this as a sign of purity. He wrote letters to bishops, bragging of his child saint, untouched by vanity, beyond flesh, silent and obedient. He had her cloistered, voluntarily he claimed, into a small stone chamber off the manor's chapel. She was to live as an anchoress, sealed away from the world, devoting herself to prayer. She was 13. The villagers whispered. Some believed she had died and was buried secretly. Others claimed her soul had flown from her body and now haunted the chapel in sorrow. The truth, of course, was crueler. For 5 years she lived inside that room. One small window for bread and water, one crucifix, one straw bed, and her father's voice once a week reading from the book of Revelation, his favourite. She listened. She never spoke, until the night the manor burned. They said lightning struck the chapel's roof during a storm. Others believed it was arson. The fire swept quickly through the timber beams and caught the rafters. The chapel collapsed inward, sealing the girl's stone cell in a cocoon of smoke and silence. She was never found. Guillaume wept for the first time in years, but not, they say, for his daughter. He mourned the destruction of his sacred space. In time, the manor was abandoned. The ivy took the walls. Travellers said they could hear whispers in the night, the faint scratching of fingers on stone, a girl's voice praying not for salvation, but for release. So why was Guillaume de Montfort among the worst fathers of medieval history? Not because he struck her, not because he left her hungry or destitute, but because he turned faith into a prison, silence into a virtue, and robbed a child not just of her life, but herself. And as we drift to sleep tonight, let us imagine Isabel not in stone, but in a meadow, running, barefoot, hair flowing free, chasing birds and dreaming stories no one will ever burn again. And so ends part 1. Part 2. Far to the north, beyond the mists of Britannia and the rolling moors of Cumbria, there once lived a man whose shadow outgrew even the long winters of the Highlands. His name was Donchad mac Duib, known to the chroniclers simply as Duncan of the Black Stone. A Scottish laird of the mid-13th century, Duncan was both feared and praised, a paradoxical figure whose legacy echoed through clan songs and cautionary lullabies. Yet, behind the hero's tales and roaring hearth feasts was a story few dared to tell, that of his only son, Alasdair. Alasdair was born during the waning days of September, when the lochs glimmered silver under stormy skies and the air smelt of peat and pine. The midwives whispered that he came into the world without crying, a quiet child with solemn eyes and a gaze that unsettled even the cattle. To Duncan, this was not weakness, it was a sign. He's touched by the old blood, the laird had said, a child of the stone. You see, Duncan believed in more than steel and strategy. He revered the stones, the standing ones that dotted the hills, silent monoliths older than any church. He said the stones spoke in dreams, that they chose who should rule and who should kneel, and he believed Alasdair had been chosen. From the age of 3, Alasdair's life followed a strange rhythm. Each morning began before sunrise, dragged from his bed and taken barefoot to the megalith circle that crowned the high hill beyond the keep. There, in the mist and cold, Duncan would kneel with him, pressing the boy's forehead to the largest stone, the black one, he called it. "Listen," he'd whisper, "let it shape your bones." Alasdair never understood what he was meant to hear, only that the stone was cold, unyielding, and it made his head ache. At 5, the real training began, not in swordplay, not in archery, but in stillness. Duncan demanded silence, endurance, and obedience, not to himself, but to the land. Alasdair would be left for hours in the woods, told to return only when he could name every bird by sound, every herb by scent. He learned to stalk deer not with spear, but with breath held until his vision blurred. He ate roots, drank dew, and learned to sleep out in the crook of trees. But a child is not a stone. Alasdair's body began to betray him. He grew thin, pale, his joints ached, his eyes developed a slight tremor. The other clansmen watched with unease, unsure if this was devotion or slow cruelty. But none dared challenge Duncan. He was a war hero, a man who had routed the Norse at the Bay of Dunrai, who had buried his blade in the hearts of 3 rival chiefs. Even the Bishop of Dunkeld avoided his halls. It was Alasdair's 7th winter when things shifted. A rare frost descended across the highlands, seizing even the underground springs. Food grew scarce, cattle died, and Duncan, obsessed with omens, turned to prophecy. He claimed a voice had spoken to him from the Black Stone, that the clan's survival depended on a sacrifice, a blood offering, a son's loyalty. No one knew what he truly meant until the night of the midwinter moon. A feast had been planned, sparse but hopeful. Torches lit the frozen courtyard, and the clansfolk gathered in furs and quiet songs. Duncan rose from his throne with a cup of dark ale and a voice full of thunder. "Tonight," he proclaimed, "we seal our bond with the old ways." He took Alasdair by the hand, dressed in ceremonial garb, white tunic, bare feet, ash smeared across his chest. The boy didn't resist. He never did. Not even when he was led past the fires up the hill to the stone circle, not even when he was laid upon the altar of black granite. But something changed in that moment. Some say it was a gust of wind that blew out the torches. Others say it was the silence, the utter absence of sound, as if even the owls held their breath. But most believed it was the voice of the laird's wife, Ailís. She had died giving birth to Alasdair, or so they thought. But on that night a figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in torn wool, hair wild with snow, eyes blazing. It was her. Pale, gaunt, skeletal, Ailís. She had not died. She had been imprisoned. Madness had seized her in childbirth, and Duncan, fearing scandal, had declared her dead and locked her in the tower, a secret kept by 3 loyal men, all long dead. Yet somehow she had escaped. She fell to her knees beside the altar and placed herself between her son and the blade. Duncan froze. The clansman stood in shock. The black stone, silent for centuries, cracked down the centre with a sound like thunder. No one ever saw Alis again. In the morning, Duncan was gone. His cloak was found near the edge of the cliffs, but his body was never recovered. Some say he walked into the sea. Others believe he fled north, chasing voices only he could hear. Alistair survived. He was taken in by one of the Kinder captains and raised in a quiet glen away from the old ways. He never took his father's title, never spoke of the stones. He became a healer, a gentle man. The lairdship passed to another branch of the clan, and Duncan of the Black Stone faded into folklore. But even now, on winter nights, shepherds say they hear strange sounds from the old hill. A boy's voice, soft and trembling, whispering names no longer remembered. And always, the cold presence of a man who once believed his son was born not to be loved, but to be offered. Let the snow fall gently on the highlands tonight. Let it cover the stones and the memories and the name of a man who mistook silence for strength. Let us rest now, the story sleeps, and so may we. In the dense fog of the Bohemian forests, where moss-covered ruins whispered of forgotten dynasties and the trees creaked like tired bones, there once stood a castle known as Hruzny Dvor, the dreadful court. Not for its architecture, which was modest, nor for its history, which was largely unremarkable, but for one man who ruled it like a spider in a brittle web, Lord Wojtek of Morava. Wojtek was not a large man. In fact, he was narrow of frame and soft-spoken, with the pallid complexion of someone who avoided sunlight like it was sin. His words were always measured, gentle almost, but his eyes told a different story, sharp, watchful, like a hawk that had forgotten how to fly but still hungered for the kill. His son, Radomir, was born in the spring of 1289, when the cherry trees bloomed in feverish white and the rains left the hills slick and tender. For the first few months, Wojtek seemed fascinated by the child. He studied him with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient map, noting every coup, every twitch. But it wasn't love. No, Wojtek was looking for signs of potential, of danger, of betrayal. You see, Wojtek believed his own son was destined to take everything from him. It started with small things, a coldness when Radomir cried, a refusal to hold him. Then came the tests. At 3, the boy was given a caged bird and told to either feed it or starve it. At 4, he was led into the forest and asked to find his way back without a torch. At 5, he was made to choose between rescuing a kitten from a well or retrieving a golden coin tossed beside it. He chose the kitten. His father did not speak to him for 3 months. But perhaps the darkest part of Radomir's childhood was the chamber beneath the library. No servants were allowed inside. The entrance was concealed behind a rotating shelf of legal scrolls and theological treatises, and the only key hung from a chain around Wojtek's neck. Within the chamber, by candlelight and the scent of damp stone, Wojtek kept what he called the Ledger of Blood. It was not a book of debts. It was a book of sins, imagined or real, that Radomir had committed. Every act of defiance, every perceived weakness, every dream he confessed. Wojtek recorded them meticulously, dated and annotated. At 8, Radomir discovered the book. He read the entries in silence, heart sinking. Lied about breaking the cup, potential for deception. Cried when stung by bees, emotional weakness. Asked about mother, attachment to the dead, sign of distraction. The boy had no memory of his mother. She had died, he was told, in childbirth. The truth was much murkier. Castle whispers spoke of screams in the birthing chamber, not of pain, but of argument. Some said Wojtek had struck her, others that he'd locked the door and let the labour go on too long without aid. No one dared speak it aloud. Radomir tried to please his father. He studied Latin, memorised philosophy, learned chess, rode without saddle, but nothing was enough. Every triumph was dissected, every joy punished. On his 10th birthday he was given a hound puppy. He loved it instantly. Named it Milacek. 2 days later, the dog disappeared. Radomir searched the woods in tears. That night, Wojtek asked him, "Do you feel stronger now that the weakness is gone?" Years passed in this shadow play of mind and fear, but something quiet began to change in Radomir. Not hatred, something colder, a calm, creeping clarity. He no longer cried, he no longer begged. He began to keep his own book, a secret one. hidden beneath a stone flag in his chamber floor, a journal of his father's words, patterns, routines. He was learning not to love his father, but to predict him, like a storm. When he turned 15, Radomir stopped speaking altogether, not from trauma, but from strategy. Silence became his armor. Wojciech, perplexed, ramped up the games. He created illusions of betrayal, bribing servants to mislead Radomir, planting letters of imaginary conspiracies, blaming him for imaginary crimes. And then came the final test. One winter night, the torches were extinguished early. The castle grew quiet. Too quiet. Radomir was summoned to the lower hall, where Wojciech stood beside a small iron cage. Inside it, huddled and blindfolded, was a boy his own age, mud-caked, bruised, trembling. Wojciech offered Radomir a blade. "This boy," he said softly, "was sent to kill me. He carries a vial of poison under his tongue. If you do not kill him, he will escape and strike in the night. He is trained to lie. He will say he is innocent. He will beg. But he is a weapon." The boy did beg. His name was Mate, a stable-hand's son from a nearby manor, taken days ago on the road. He had never seen Wojciech before. He had no poison, no weapon, only tears. Radomir said nothing. He looked at the knife, then at his father. He turned and walked away. That night, Radomir climbed the tower, not to jump, but to watch. He stood under the moon, listening to the wind in the trees, and somewhere deep inside him something broke, not like glass, but like soil cracking in drought. He waited until dawn. When the castle stirred and Wojciech emerged to find the boy gone, a servant rushed to report that the stable was open. The hound's collar, the one Radomir had buried after finding its bones years ago, was left hanging on the gate. And inside the chamber beneath the library, the ledger of blood was gone. Wojciech searched for months, sent men across Moravia, but Radomir was never seen again. Some say he fled east, to the Carpathians, and became a scholar of silence. Others believe he became a monk in a nameless monastery where vows of speechlessness were kept for life. But there's an old story in Bohemia that on certain winter nights, a hooded man visits crumbling castles and leaves behind a small leather-bound book. Inside it, names, dates, and sins. And somewhere on a page near the front, in crisp, deliberate script, is written, "Not all sons slay their fathers. Some simply leave them behind, buried beneath the weight of their own obsessions. Let us now rest in the hush of forgotten places, where even fear eventually is overgrown by moss and memory. In the lowlands of Flanders, where the mists rise like ghosts from the marshes and the wind carries the scent of wet iron and wheat, there once reigned a man who wore piety like armour and righteousness like a blade. His name was Lord Engelram of Ghent, a devout noble, a patron of the church, and a man who fathered 12 children, but claimed none. It was said that Engelram prayed more than he spoke, fasted more than he feasted, and wept more for the sins of the world than for any sorrow within his halls. His manor, de Grauer Hof, stood like a monastery amidst fertile fields. No music ever echoed from its walls, no laughter carried through its courtyards. Only the rustle of cloaks, the shuffle of barefoot servants, and the cold chime of the chapel bell that rang every night at the hour of confession. Of his 12 children, 9 were daughters. They were sent off early, into convents, orphanages, and one even into silence, cloistered at the Abbey of St. Hildegard at the age of 5. Engelram never spoke of them again. The remaining 3 were boys, Joris, Emiel, and the youngest, Pieter. This is not a story about all 3. Only one, Pieter. Born during a summer eclipse in 1305, Pieter entered the world under a sky of shadows. His mother, Lady Isabeau, passed in the night, her breath shallow and fading with the final cry of the infant in her arms. Engelram, standing at the doorway of the chamber, did not approach the bed. He watched in silence as the midwives washed the child and wrapped him in cloth. Then he turned and walked away. The eclipse, he said, was an omen. Pieter grew in the care of nuns employed within the estate, women who treated him kindly, if distantly, always afraid to displease their master. The boy was quiet, thoughtful, with a curious mind and a love for scribbling poems on scraps of parchment. He had a soft voice, gentle hands, and an uncanny ability to soothe animals. By the age of 7, he could read both Latin and Old French, and he spent hours in the manor library, tracing the spines of theological volumes and peering out the narrow windows at the swaying barley fields. But his father never spoke to him. Not once. Engelram passed Pieter in the halls during morning prayers at mealtime. He acknowledged his steward, his guards, his servants. But to his son, he gave only silence. The boy tried in small ways to earn attention. He recited prayers louder, he studied longer, he copied entire psalms by hand. But his father's eyes, ever sunken and distant, saw only the altar and never the child kneeling before it. At 10, Pieter wrote a letter, a simple one. It read, "Dear Father, if I cannot be your joy, may I be your prayer. Your son, Pieter." He placed it on his father's desk one evening after Vespers. The next morning, he found it torn in half, left beside a candle, its edges curled in ash. Something inside Pieter dimmed. Not broken, not shattered, only dimmed. From then on, he stopped writing. He stopped trying. Engelram began speaking to others about legacy, about divine succession. He consulted abbots, theologians, even monks who practiced isolation. He asked whether a child born during an eclipse could carry a curse, whether silence from a son was a sign of demonic quietude, whether love for books and poetry was vanity cloaked in gentleness. The answers were always inconclusive. So he devised a test. When Pieter was 12, he was summoned, formally for the first time. He entered the grand hall, where his father sat beneath a tapestry of Christ's crucifixion, the light from the stained glass painting his pale features in red and gold. On the table was a parchment bearing the crest of the monastery of St. Cletus, a place known not for its learning or piety, but its remoteness. "Your soul," Engelram said, "must be shaped in silence. God speaks where the world is still." No argument was permitted, no farewell offered. Pieter was sent by cart the next morning, with only one satchel and no escort. The monastery was cold, high in the hills, wrapped in fog, surrounded by thorny thickets and wild dogs. The monks practiced a strict vow of silence, broke bread only once a day, and slept on stone. For years, Pieter endured. He obeyed, he studied, he grew taller, thinner, paler, and within that silence he began to hear his own voice again. But not in words, in song. He composed hymns silently, melodies etched in the rhythm of his steps, the timing of his breath. He taught himself to read musical notation, copying fragments from the scriptorium by moonlight. His soul, once ignored, began to hum. When he was 17, a visiting scribe from Ghent heard him humming faintly while sweeping the chapel steps. The man was stunned. He stayed another day, then 2. And finally he invited Pieter to return with him, to the abbey in Bruges, where music was studied as divine language. Pieter hesitated. But when he returned to his cell that night, he found something tucked beneath his pillow. A torn half of parchment. Ash-streaked, faded, but legible. "If I cannot be your joy, may I be your prayer." His own words. No one knew how it had arrived. The monastery had no visitors that week. Engelram, it was said, had grown ill, bedridden, muttering of shadows and judgment, unable to eat. Whether he sent it, or whether fate returned Pieter's longing to him, none could say. Pieter left the next morning. He became a cantor in Bruges, then a composer. He never spoke of his father, never returned to De Grauwe Hof. When Engelram died, no sons attended the funeral. The estate passed to the church. The chapel bell, once rung nightly, fell silent and rusted. But in the great cathedral of Bruges, there remains one hymn, anonymous, gentle, haunting, called Filiorum Umbrae, Children of the Shadow. Its final stanza ends with the lines, "Even in silence the soul may sing, and in the absence of love the heart still dreams." Tonight let us sleep with the sound of gentle hymns in our minds. Let us dream for those who waited for love that never came, and found it anyway, somewhere deep inside themselves. The Rhône River runs wide and slow through the valleys of Provence, winding past lavender fields, olive groves, and ancient ruins with names long forgotten. But there is one bend in the river, near a crumbling chapel that leans into the wind like a weary pilgrim, where the water still remembers a name. Arnaud de Béziers. Arnaud was a knight in name, a lord in title, but most of all he was a zealot, cloaked in the righteousness of the sword, the cross, and the authority of Rome. His armour was always polished, his banners always pure white, embroidered with crimson lilies and the motto, Fiat voluntas Dei, let God's will be done. And he believed, unwaveringly, that God's will had made him father to a boy meant for war. The boy's name was Etienne. Etienne was born in the year of the great comet, 1313, a year when peasants muttered about omens and midwives crossed themselves before touching a child. The comet hung in the sky for weeks, its tail a silver flame, like a blade stretched across heaven. Arnaud, upon seeing his son for the first time, said only, "He will bring fire to the heretics." Etienne did not know what a heretic was, only that when he was 4, his wooden toys were taken from him and replaced with dull daggers. That when he cried, he was made to kneel in grain until his knees bled. That laughter was forbidden, that meals were prayers with bitter bread. And that each night his father whispered verses of vengeance in his ear. Arnaud trained him not as a son, but as a weapon. By 6, Etienne was made to memorize the articles of the Inquisition. By 7, he could recite from memory every edict condemning the Cathars. At 8, he was forced to attend an execution, a woman accused of consorting with spirits. Etienne trembled, turned away as the flames rose. His father gripped his chin and forced him to look. "Mercy," he said, "is the first corruption. Purge it." Etienne began to change, not into a soldier, but into a mirror. He smiled less, spoke only when asked, slept in silence. He obeyed every command, not out of fear, but out of calculation. He learned to mimic piety, to wear obedience like a second skin. And within that stillness his thoughts turned inward, quiet and sharp like ice beneath a frozen pond. Then came the campaign. At the age of 12, Arnaud brought his son to Languedoc, where tensions smouldered between the papal forces and suspected remnants of the Cathar faith. The boy was given a sword, a white tabard, and a task: accompany the patrols. Observe, report, punish. In one village, a woman refused to give up the name of her brother, a known preacher. Arnaud ordered her son, barely older than Etienne, to be taken. Etienne watched as the guards dragged the boy away. That night, he found the child's discarded shoes and buried them behind the chapel. He told no one. In another town, a friar was accused of hiding heretical texts. Arnaud handed Etienne a torch and pointed to the shelves. "Cleanse the rot," he said. Etienne lit the fire. The flames licked the air with a hungry crackle, and in their glow he saw his father smile for the first time in months. But it was not joy, it was pride, and that, somehow, hurt more. The turning point came on a rain-soaked morning near the village of Miraval. The patrol had captured a man and his daughter, both suspected of hiding fugitives. They were tied to posts, their feet half submerged in muddy water, their faces streaked with fear and rain. Arnaud handed Etienne a crossbow. "A test," he said. "One bolt. Choose the one who lied." The girl was no older than 10. Her eyes met Etienne's, not in plea, but in silent understanding. Etienne raised the crossbow, aimed it at the rope holding the man's wrists. The bolt snapped the cord, and in the moment of shock, the girl screamed. The man lunged, and chaos erupted. Guards surged forward, blades drawn. Etienne ran, through the field, through the mud, through the brambles. He didn't stop until night fell. He slept beneath an overturned cart, heart-pounding, and for the first time in years, he wept. He returned the next morning, expecting fury, punishment, exile. But Arnaud was calm, too calm. He invited Etienne into the tent, poured him water, sat beside him. "I was like you once," Arnaud said, "before the fire cleansed me." Then he opened a chest and took out a collar. Iron, narrow, covered in tiny etchings of scripture. "My father gave this to me. I wore it for a month, without sleep, without rest, until my soul stopped yearning for softness, and when it was done, I became the man God needed." He placed it in Etienne's hands. "Now you." Etienne took the collar, said nothing. That night he stood alone by the river, watching the moon shimmer on the surface. He held the collar in both hands, and then, quietly, he let it sink. 3 days later, Etienne was gone. A stolen horse, a broken gate. No word, no note, only the sound of hooves fading into the forest. Arnaud searched for weeks. His patrols scoured the region. Some claimed to have seen the boy in Avignon. Others said he boarded a ship west. But the truth was never found. Arnaud returned to Béziers alone. He kept the tent where the collar had been offered. Every night he sat before it in prayer, whispering the same phrase, "Purge the mercy." But the fire he had lit in others could not warm his own soul. His body weakened, his sight faded. In time, even his memory of Etienne blurred. Not the face, but the boy beneath it. The boy who had once written a poem about rivers and constellations and hidden it in the hollow of an old sycamore. Years later, in a monastery in Spain, a manuscript was discovered. Anonymous, a treatise on forgiveness disguised as a commentary on ancient hymns. Its final passage read, Some fathers forge sons like swords, but I chose to rust, to bend, to bury my edge in soil, not flesh, and in doing so I remembered that I was not born to pierce, but to hold. Etienne was never seen again, but the river remembers. It carries the iron collar beneath its surface, tumbling softly over stones, worn smooth by time and regret. Tonight, let that river flow through your dreams, quiet, endless, bearing away the weight of those who demanded too much and gave too little. Let the silence be peace. Let the memory be gentle. Let the boy escape again and again. The wind that brushes through the Baltic coast is a bitter, sharp thing. Never still, never warm, always laced with the breath of salt and centuries. And in that wind once stood a keep carved from grey stone, perched at the edge of a cliff like a clenched fist. It was called Thornhold. And its master, Duke Henrik von Rugen, was known not for his victories in battle, nor for his alliances or treaties, but for the legacy of ice he left within his bloodline. Henrik believed in discipline, but not the kind etched in law or enforced by rule. He believed in something older, harsher. A law of the bones, he called it, a philosophy he claimed had been passed down from the old gods of the north, forgotten in the wake of Christ, but not truly gone. To him, love was softness, mercy was decay, and children were not to be nurtured, but tempered like steel. His son Jacob was born beneath a frost moon in 1321. The midwife declared him still, silent and pale, until a sudden breath broke the hush and startled the owl perched in the rafters. "He's stubborn," the woman whispered. "He's come to stay." Henrik said nothing. He only handed her a coin and walked out into the snow. Jacob grew in a castle that seemed carved from winter itself. The windows were narrow and high, the halls lined with wolf pelts and banners of deep blue. Servants spoke in whispers. Fires were small, rationed. Even laughter seemed like something that might crack the stone if left unchecked. Henrik watched his son like a man inspects a blade still cooling from the forge. Each motion, each stumble, each word was measured. At 4, Jacob asked for a story. At 5, he asked to sleep beside the hearth. At 6, he asked to see the sea. Each time, Henrik responded the same way, with a task. You want warmth? Sleep in the cold first. You want stories? Write your own. You want to see the sea? Earn your way to its edge. So Jacob learned not to ask. But the boy was clever and quiet. He read books in secret, parchments stored in the abandoned tower library, hidden behind mildewed banners and forgotten relics. He learned languages, Low German, Latin, Old Norse. He memorized maps, traced coastlines with his fingers, and spoke to the old cook in riddles, delighting in her cryptic tales of sea spirits and drowned kings. Henrik noticed, and he did not approve. When Jacob was 9, he found a bird with a broken wing near the stables. He wrapped it in cloth, fed it scraps, sang to it beneath his breath. For days he cared for it, named it Ljus, the old word for light. And on the 7th morning he brought it to his father, smiling, a rare and radiant thing. Henrik took the bird, looked at it, then crushed it in one hand. It would have died in the wild, he said flatly, wiping the blood on his cloak. Now it dies with purpose. Jacob didn't cry. Not aloud. But that night he ripped every page he had written, every sketch, every copied poem. He buried the pieces under the snow and did not return to the tower again for many months. By 12 the lessons grew crueler. Henrik constructed mazes in the lower chambers, filled them with puzzles, traps and deceptions. Jacob was left inside with a single candle and a time limit. Sometimes he was denied food until he solved them. Other times, sleep. Once, even his voice. He was gagged for a week to learn the silence of strategy. He endured, not out of strength, but necessity. He understood now that love would never come. So instead, he became what his father wanted, on the surface, stoic, efficient, sharp-eyed. The other nobles who visited spoke of him as a boy of iron. Some admired it, others pitied it, no one dared question it. But beneath the surface, Jacob was building something else. Not revenge, not hatred, something colder. Escape. He began collecting fragments, broken tools, unused locks, discarded chain links. He memorized guard rotations, the timing of tides, the location of weak stones in the cliff wall, and he waited. The opportunity came in winter, when the outer walls froze solid and even the sea turned sluggish with ice. A merchant ship had wrecked near the coast, and Henrik led a small party to scavenge. Jacob, now 14, was left alone in the keep, or so they thought. He moved quickly. Lit no torches. packed nothing but a knife and a leather satchel containing parchment, a compass, and a single remaining page from his earliest writings, the one piece he hadn't burned. He scaled the southern face of the cliff in silence. The climb nearly killed him. But when he reached the bottom, breath ragged, hands bloodied, he looked up at Thornhold and felt no fear, only distance, only cold air and a different kind of silence. Henrik returned to find Jakob's chamber empty, the tower library ransacked, and a message carved into the frost-covered window. Steel does not bend, but ice melts. He did not speak of it, not to his men, not to his servants, but every night after he stood at the edge of the cliff, staring into the darkness as if expecting it to return his son. Jakob was never found. But years later, travellers spoke of a scholar in Danzig who lived above a candlemaker's shop, taught children letters for free, and carried an old satchel patched with blue thread. He never spoke of his past, but one pupil recalled that on the coldest nights he would recite in a slow, soft voice a poem about birds that fly even with broken wings, a small tribute to a boy who was never allowed to be soft, but who chose to be human anyway. Tonight, may the frost stay beyond your window, may the fire at your feet never die, and may your dreams be free of stone walls and silent fathers. Drift gently. Let the wind pass. Let the child climb down the cliff and never look back. In the heart of Castile, where the golden plains stretch endlessly beneath a sky too wide to contain sorrow, there stood a fortress known as Castillo del Silencio, the Castle of Silence. Its towers were not the tallest, nor its walls the thickest, but it held a reputation heavier than stone. For within its walls lived Don Mateo de Luarca, a man whose voice was soft, whose hands were clean, and whose cruelty wore the mask of devotion. He was not known for war or politics, but for scripture, a scholar of sacred texts, a patron of cathedrals, a man whose donations lined the pockets of bishops and whose presence was welcomed with bowed heads and whispered prayers. But behind the sermons and the Latin chants was a man who believed in hierarchy, not just of class or blood, but of worth. And in his mind, children were born low, souls to be shaped like clay or punished like sin. His firstborn, Tomas, came into the world under a hush of starlight in 1337, a quiet baby with eyes too solemn for his age. His mother, Doña Amalia, died 2 winters later, struck by fever while reciting evening prayers beside the hearth. After that, the castle grew colder. Tomas was raised among nuns and tutors. His father rarely spoke to him directly. Orders came through parchment. Affection came through absence. He was watched, measured, evaluated, not as a boy, but as a vessel. Don Mateo saw childhood as a disease that must be outgrown with haste. Play was forbidden, music was vanity, tears were punished with silence. At 6, Tomas was locked in the chapel for 3 days for speaking out of turn. Bread and water, candles that flickered and cast long shadows on the crucifix. He emerged pale, trembling, but quiet. That, to Don Mateo, was progress. The servants pitied the child. A chambermaid once smuggled in a carved wooden bird, hoping to bring him some cheer. Tomas adored it, cradled it, spoke to it in secret when no one watched. It chirped when the wind moved through its tiny mouth. He named it Lucerito, little light. When Don Mateo found it, he did not shout. He did not strike. He called Tomas to the dining hall and placed the bird on the table. "This," he said softly, "is the voice of distraction." Then, slowly, methodically, he crushed it beneath a silver goblet. He ordered Tomas to eat his supper next to the broken pieces. And the boy did, without a word. Years passed. Tomas grew tall, lean and deliberate. He spoke with precision. He walked without sound. He learned to anticipate commands before they were given. At 10, he could transcribe sermons from memory. At 11, he surpassed his tutors in theology. At 12, he stopped dreaming. Don Mateo, seeing the transformation, began to invite clerics and nobles to observe his miracle of discipline. Tomas was paraded like a relic. He is the fruit of spiritual order, Mateo would say, proof that a child can become divine when stripped of indulgence. But they did not see the boy at night. They did not see the candle he left burning, always hidden in the hollow of the fireplace. They did not see the pages he wrote by moonlight, secret letters never sent, addressed to a mother he barely remembered. They did not hear the songs he whispered into the stone walls, just loud enough for the echoes to carry, but not loud enough to be punished. And they never knew about the door. In the lowest part of the castle, behind a shelf in the library, Tomas discovered a forgotten passage, a servant's tunnel, crumbling and overgrown. At 13, he began clearing it by hand, each night a little more. A brick loosened, a stone shifted, dirt scraped away with a spoon, not with the urgency of escape, but the patience of survival. Then, one spring, everything changed. A storm rolled in from the west, furious and black. Lightning struck the stables. Fire roared across the courtyard. In the chaos, the chapel roof collapsed. Tomas had just returned from evening prayer. He stood frozen, watching the flames consume the altar. Don Mateo arrived moments later, rain pouring down his face. He grabbed his son by the shoulder and whispered, "This is judgment. This is your test. Do not move." And he left. He left the boy to stand there to face the fire alone. But Tomas did not move. He didn't run. He didn't cry. He stood until the storm passed and the fire had devoured the last of the chapel's rafters. When morning came, the boy was gone. No horse was missing. No doors were broken. The guards had seen nothing. Don Mateo ordered a search, but found nothing. Only a small bundle of parchment buried in the ashes of the fireplace. They were not letters. They were not scripture. They were poems. One of them read, "I have been shaped like stone, but stones remember rivers. I have been silenced like breath, but even breath leaves fog on glass, and when I go, I leave behind a shadow that cannot be burned." Tomas was never seen again. But over the years, stories emerged. A teacher in Toledo who taught orphans to sing. A monk in Aragon who carved birds from olive wood and left them in churches without a name. A masked actor in a travelling troupe who performed silent plays about boys and broken toys, watched with tears by grown men who didn't know why. Don Mateo grew old, alone. The castle of silence remained quiet, but not peacefully so. The halls echoed strangely, windows refused to shut, and every year on the night of the chapel fire a candle would flicker to life in the fireplace, though no one ever lit it. Let that candle glow in our dreams tonight. Let it light the way for all the children who learned too soon how to be quiet, and later how to vanish with grace. Sleep gently where fire cannot reach, and silence means peace, not punishment. The marshes of East Anglia are thick with mist and memory, where the reeds sway like ghostly hands and the crows caw as if echoing old confessions. And nestled deep among those watery veins once stood a manor, half swallowed by the land, its timbers dark with rot and its halls heavy with secrets. It was called Fenmere Hall, and its master was a man both feared and pitied, Sir Aldred of Ely. Sir Aldred had not always been cruel. That, at least, is what the villagers whispered. They said he had once been a kind man, gentle even, before the fire that took his wife and firstborn son. Before the accident that left the left side of his face twisted and pale. Before he stopped riding into town, and before the laughter in his home fell permanently silent. After the fire, Sir Aldred became obsessed with the idea of legacy. Of redemption, perhaps, but more so of correction. And when a second son was born to him, 9 months after his wife's death, he did not welcome the child with joy. He named him Edwin, but he never called him by name. To Aldred, Edwin was not a child. He was an equation, a second attempt, a vessel for all that had been lost and all that had gone wrong. He did not raise him with love, but with conditions. The boy was pale, wiry, with thick lashes and a voice that cracked early. He had a softness to him, a gentleness, that unsettled his father. He preferred carving to swordplay, moss to metal, and he spoke to the birds as if they were people. He collected feathers, drew faces in the condensation on windows, sang to himself in the corners of forgotten rooms. By the age of 6, Aldred declared him fragile of soul and began the process of moulding. It began with voice drills. Edwin was made to speak scripture aloud for hours, correcting his posture, tone, and pitch. Then came the silence tests, entire days without speech, during which a single word could cost him food. Then came pain, the burning of fingertips with candle wax, the holding of stones in outstretched arms, the barefoot walks through the frozen marsh. It's not punishment, Aldred would say. It's practice for life. Edwin learned to endure. He grew quieter, sharper, older than his years. But the strangeness within him remained, like a stubborn ember that refused to extinguish. He painted with mud, made puppets from reeds, and once tied ribbons to a weasel's tail just to watch them flutter in the wind. He did not speak of pain. But he kept a secret diary carved into a hollow beam in the attic where he slept. There he wrote with charcoal stolen from the hearth. He watches me like a mirror that won't smile. I think he's afraid I'll laugh. I think he forgets I was not the one who burned. Sir Aldred never climbed to the attic. He believed children belonged close to the floor, close to the earth. Elevation, he said, belonged to the dead or the divine, not boys. At 9, Edwin found a baby heron tangled in the rushes near the manor moat. Its leg was broken, its wing half torn. He hid it beneath the stable floor, feeding it bits of eel and lake fish. It healed slowly, limping but alive. He named it Worm. He spoke to it each night, told it stories, sang lullabies. And when it grew strong enough to stand, he released it beneath the willow tree near the water's edge. It flew only a short distance, then circled the hall once before vanishing into the fog. A week later, Aldred summoned Edwin to the study. He said nothing, only opened a cloth bundle. Inside was Worm, neck twisted, wings clipped, feathers still damp. Edwin looked, blinked, and turned away. He didn't cry. That night, he returned to the attic and carved a new line into the beam. He kills what sings, because it remembers how to fly. By 12, the manor felt less like a home and more like a tomb. Servants left without notice. Guests stopped arriving. Letters remained unanswered. And Aldred began to speak not to Edwin, but to portraits, especially the one of his dead wife. He would sit for hours beneath her faded image, muttering, "He doesn't see you in the boy, not a single piece." One evening, Edwin sat beside the hearth, quietly carving a small figure from driftwood, a bird with outstretched wings. His father entered, took one look, and seized it. He held it in the flames until it blackened. "You still think you can fly?" Edwin didn't respond. That night, Aldred locked the attic door from the outside. 3 days passed, no water, only wind and whispers. On the 4th morning, a maid climbed to the attic and found the door wide open, the window shattered. A ladder of tied bedsheets trailing down into the mist. Aldred searched the moorlands, paid for riders, posted warnings, but no trace was ever found. Only a bundle of feathers left beneath the willow where Worm had once taken flight. Years later, children in nearby villages would speak of a quiet man who lived on the edge of the fens, near the old hunter's cabin. He carved wooden animals and left them on windowsills. He never spoke. But once, when a child asked his name, he answered, "Edwin of the Marsh." And then he smiled. Just once. Sir Aldred remained alone in Fenmore Hall until his final breath, bitter and stiff, his eyes turned toward the attic ceiling as if expecting a shadow to return. But it never did, only wind and the sound of wings. Let that sound carry us into sleep tonight. Let it lift us gently from old rooms and locked doors. Let the attic window always remain open. Let the boy walk through the fog and vanish, not into silence, but into freedom. Beyond the stone bridges of Prague, where the streets narrow into alleys that twist like old secrets, there once stood a town square that locals called Dum bez Smievu, the house without laughter. Tucked between a crumbling apothecary and a long-abandoned jeweller's shop, it was not a house in the ordinary sense. It was a place of lessons, of obedience, and of silence. And at its centre lived Magistrate Bohumil Krejci, a man whose face, they said, had only ever smiled once, and that was long before his son was born. Bohumil was a man of order, the type who measured days not by sunrise or bell, but by the ticking of a brass watch he kept on a chain that never left his waistcoat. He believed in structure, in civic duty, and in the absolute supremacy of logic. Love, he once wrote in a letter to a colleague, was an inefficient emotion. It clouded reason. It weakened resolve. Children, therefore, were not to be loved, but shaped. And so he shaped his son. Lucas, like a mason, chips away at rough stone, mercilessly, meticulously, without pause. Lucas was born during a thunderstorm in 1342, as the Vltava River threatened to rise and swallow half the city. Bohumil's wife died the following winter, of fever, the physician said, but some claimed grief had hastened it. After that, the magistrate moved the nursery into his own study, not for closeness, but for control. From the beginning, Lucas was treated not as a son, but as an apprentice. At 4, he was tested on Latin declensions. At 5, he was taught to fold council documents into perfect squares. At 6, he was tasked with identifying city districts by the sound of the bells that rang from each church. When he failed, even once, he was made to kneel on stone tiles for an hour, or 2, or longer. He wasn't beaten, not in the way one might expect. Bohumil believed the body could heal too easily. Instead, he inflicted stillness, denial, long silences, withheld praise, forgotten birthdays. Once, Lucas presented a drawing of a clock tower he'd made with charcoal, meticulously shaded, elegantly structured. He placed it on his father's desk with trembling pride. Bohumil glanced at it, then asked, "What purpose does it serve?" I don't know," Lucas whispered. "Then it is meaningless." And he burned it. By 8, Lucas no longer drew, no longer sang, no longer asked questions. But deep within, a quiet rebellion took root. Not loud, not dramatic. A seed of something, of wonder perhaps, or stubbornness. The kind that cannot be scolded out or locked away. It began with stories. The boy found them hidden in the town's archives, tucked between ledgers and tax records. Old Bohemian folk tales copied by a bored scribe centuries earlier. He read them in secret by candlelight. Tales of river spirits and lost princes, of riddles and shapeshifters, of laughter that broke spells and kindness that changed fates. He copied them into a small leather book he stitched together with scraps of parchment and twine. He called it Śmiewki, Little Smiles. When he was 10, he began sneaking into the nearby orphanage at dusk, sharing stories with children who had never known a bedtime tale. He whispered them through cracked windows, drew scenes on walls with chalk, left folded notes beneath pillows. He never signed them, only drew a tiny son with a smiling face. He was, to the children, a ghost of joy, but secrets never sleep forever. One night, a candle tipped in the study. A ledger caught fire. Servants rushed to put it out. In the chaos, Bohumil discovered the hidden book, Śmiewki. He read each story, not with anger, but with contempt. To him, these tales were dangerous. They encouraged whimsy, disobedience, fantasy. They undermined everything he had built. He confronted Lucas at dawn. "There is no such thing as magic," he said, voice low. "There is no kindness in the world, only consequence. You will burn this, yourself." He held out the book and a taper. Lucas took them, and he stepped toward the hearth. But instead of tossing the book into the fire, he threw it at his father's feet. "I won't forget them," he said, "even if you do." It was the first time he had spoken without being asked in over 3 years. Bohumil stared. For a moment, just a breath, something shifted in his face. Not sorrow, not rage, something like recognition. But it vanished. He did not punish Lucas. He simply removed him. The next morning, Lucas was gone, sent to an abbey far north, a silent one, where speech was rationed like water. The magistrate told the council it was for the boy's spiritual correction. No one questioned him. Years passed. The house without laughter grew older, darker. Bohumil remained magistrate, precise and tireless. But his hair greyed faster than most. His eyes grew dull, and he began speaking less and less, even in council. Some said he'd begun hearing bells that weren't ringing. Others said he started keeping a candle lit by the hearth each night, waiting for someone who would never return. Then, one winter, a book appeared in the town square. Not sold, not claimed, just left. Bound in soft leather, a sun on the cover. Inside, dozens of stories, new and old. A dedication read, "For those who were taught silence, but remembered how to sing." The magistrate never acknowledged it, but a servant once swore she saw him reading it by moonlight, his hand resting lightly on a page about a boy who turned shadows into birds. Bohumil Krejci died with no heir. The house without laughter was turned into a school, and above its door, carved in wood, was a single line. Even logic fears the joy it cannot name. Tonight, may your dreams be filled with whispered tales and chalk-drawn suns. May you walk winding alleys and find stories folded beneath your pillow. And may the silence that shaped you never steal your song. Sleep well, little storyteller. You are not forgotten. High in the Alps of Tyrol, where the sky wears a crown of snow and the wind whistles secrets through craggy peaks, there once stood a fortress known as Steintraum, Stone Dream. Built into the mountain itself, its walls were cold even in midsummer, its halls carved from the bones of the earth. Travellers often passed below it without ever knowing it was there, shrouded in mist and legend. And within those stone ribs lived a man both revered and feared, Baron Ulrich von Graben. Ulrich was a man of great intellect and greater stillness. A student of alchemy, astronomy, and ancient tongues, he kept a library larger than his dining hall and spoke with the gravity of someone always calculating. He believed emotion was an interruption of the divine order. He once wrote that love is entropy, Discipline is eternity. And when his son Mathis was born under a red moon, he saw it not as a cause for celebration, but as an equation to be solved. Mathis was quiet by nature. His mother, Ilsa, had died giving birth to him, and from that first breath the boy was treated more as artifact than heir. Ulrich did not cradle him. He measured him. He did not sing to him. He charted his sleep patterns. Every cough was recorded, every reaction timed. By age 3, Mathis was made to sit through lectures in Latin. By 4, he was learning to identify mineral compositions and draw astronomical charts. But he was not unhappy. Not at first. He loved the stars. Not because they were part of his father's regimen, but because they were his only friends. He'd spend nights at the highest window of the fortress, pressing his cheek to the cold glass, whispering to the constellations as though they might whisper back. He gave them names not found in books. Leona, Turvan, Old Grey. He believed they were watching him. His father, upon discovering this, grew concerned. Anthropomorphism, he muttered, a sign of regression. A child should not fantasize. He ordered the window bricked over. Mathis did not cry. But that night, he scratched a message into the wall with a loose nail. "You cannot hide stars with stone. They live inside me now." Ulrich intensified the training. He introduced silence days, entire spans where Mathis was not allowed to speak or be spoken to. He believed it sharpened the mind. Mathis bore it well. But he began writing poems in the margins of his alchemy scrolls, tiny verses tucked between formulae and diagrams. When Ulrich found them, he burned them one by one. "This is not language," he said, "it is waste." At 9, Mathis was tasked with cataloguing every object in the fortress, each artifact, each scroll, each bottle of tincture, by weight, age, and presumed function. It took him 3 months. When he finished, he handed his father a final page, unnumbered. On it, he had listed himself. Specimen, Mathis. Material, flesh, dream function, uncertain, weight, increasing daily, age, unknown. Not by this clock. Ulrich tore it apart and locked the boy in the observatory for a week. But something had begun to change. Not in Mathis. In the fortress. Strange things began to happen. Windows cracked for no reason. Mirrors warped. Flames flickered in patterns. And Ulrich began hearing voices in the walls, soft, rhythmic, like lullabies in a language he didn't know. He blamed the altitude, the cold, the loss of his wife. He never considered that perhaps, just perhaps, it was Mathis, because the boy had not stopped whispering to the stars. He had simply learned to do it in silence. He carved symbols behind shelves, drew constellations in chalk where no one looked. He mapped the fortress like a living thing, its breath, its hum, its echo. And with every step he began to listen not just to the stars, but to the stone itself. At 10, he discovered the hidden chamber. Buried beneath the south tower, behind a panel of loose rock, it was a forgotten room, circular, domed, covered in carvings that did not match any language in his father's tomes. Mathis recognized them instinctively. He sat there for hours, tracing them with his fingertips, humming softly. He began to dream of staircases that led nowhere, doors that opened into starlight, voices that spoke without sound. One night, Ulrich awoke to silence so deep it felt like drowning. The entire fortress had gone still. No fire crackled, no wind moaned, only silence. And then, footsteps, soft, barefoot, echoing in impossible directions. He followed them, torch in hand, down corridor after corridor, until he reached the hidden chamber. And there was Mathis, standing in the center, eyes closed, arms outstretched, the carvings on the walls glowing faintly, pulsing like breath. Ulrich called out. The boy opened his eyes and smiled. Not cruelly, not in defiance, gently, like someone who has remembered a name they'd long forgotten. "I'm not yours," he said. "I never was." And with that, the chamber vanished. Not literally, but when Ulrich stepped forward, it was gone. Only blank stone, only cold air, only silence. Mathis was never seen again. Ulrich remained in Steintraum until the end of his days, poring over every book, every map, every code, trying to find the key. Some say he lost his mind. Others say he became obsessed with building a second sun, an artificial one, carved from wax and gears. But none of them saw what the mountains saw. That every winter solstice a pattern appears in the snow outside the fortress. Not footprints, not symbols. A constellation, etched perfectly, subtly, as if from the stars themselves. They call it the child who listens. Tonight let the stars listen to you. Let the wind carry your quiet to places no map has named. Let the child find the door and open it and step into the chamber beyond stone. Sleep now. The sky is not so far. In the dense, rain-slick woods of the Ardennes, where the canopy strangles the sun and the air smells forever of wet bark and ash, there once stood a house so twisted by time it seemed grown rather than built. Its beams sagged like tired limbs, its shingles covered in moss the colour of old bruises. Locals called it La Maison Tordue, the crooked house. And inside it lived a man who rarely ventured out, save for mass or market. His name was Father Rémy Delange, and he was not just a priest. He was a father in every sense of the word, by title, by cloth, and by blood. Few knew he had a child. Fewer still ever saw her. Her name was Clémence. She was born in 1348 in the wake of plague, fire, and famine. Her mother, a seamstress with a voice like honey, died giving birth to her in a forest hut while Rémy was off burying the dead of another village. When he returned and found only the child wrapped in his wife's apron, alive, wailing alone, he took her in without a word and never once spoke her mother's name again. He brought her to the crooked house, and he raised her in shadows. To the world, Father Rémy was pious, learned, devout. He offered sermons rich with metaphor, spoke gently to sinners, and fed the poor when the bishop wasn't watching. But in the crooked rooms of his home, he was different. Cold, stern, quietly exacting. He believed sin lived in the body like mould in wood. That the only way to raise a holy child was to dry out the softness before it could grow into something rotten. Clémence was not allowed mirrors, not allowed to laugh. She was taught to read only scripture, to recite not poems but psalms. At 6, she was made to fast every 7th day. At 7, she was told her voice was too loud. By 8, she spoke only when spoken to. Her hair was always kept short, her dresses plain. She was never permitted outside unless the moon was high or the fog thick. "The world stains children," her father would say. "I will keep you white as snow." But Clémence had her mother's voice. She sang when she was alone, little hums, half melodies. Sometimes just the wind echoed through her lips. She sang to the birds who landed on the crooked windowsill, to the mice beneath the floorboards, to the saints painted in the fading icons above the stairs. She sang not to be heard, but to remember she was alive. One day, Father Rémy heard her. She was in the attic, beneath a broken skylight, singing to the sunlight that managed to trickle through. A lullaby she didn't know she remembered. A song her mother must have once hummed, perhaps even during birth. He climbed the ladder, stood there. She turned, startled, fell silent. He didn't speak, only stepped forward, knelt beside her, and with hands that did not shake, shaved her head. Then he said, "Your voice is the serpent's tongue. You will fast for 10 days, and you will sleep on stone." And so she did. But the song did not leave her. It moved deeper inside her, curled like a seed in her chest. From then on, she stopped singing aloud. Instead, she wrote songs into the walls, scratched them with nails, with bits of charcoal, with pins stolen from the hem of her plainest dress. Not lyrics, not notes, but shapes, spirals, lines that moved like melodies. When she closed her eyes, she could hear them. At 10, she discovered the hidden door. It wasn't meant to be hidden, just forgotten. Beneath the floor of the chapel's crypt, behind loose stone and bone, there was a passage carved long ago. She followed it in the dark, breathing the earth, fingers grazing ancient roots and broken prayers. At its end, a cavern, lit faintly by mosslight, with walls smooth as glass and water so still it mirrored the ceiling. There, she sang. Once, just once. The sound echoed and did not return. It stayed, lingering in the air like fog. And from that day on, she changed, not visibly. She still wore her sackcloth dresses, still nodded when spoken to, still walked with quiet steps and eyes lowered, but she began to hum, not with her voice, but with her very presence. People who passed her felt it, a tingle in the spine, a warmth in the coldest corridor. And when she touched the old wood of the pews, they no longer groaned under weight. Father Rémy noticed. He searched her room, found nothing, questioned her. She said nothing. So he prayed harder, beat his chest until it bruised, called it the work of temptation, and finally he decided she must be offered. Not in fire, but in silence. He took her deep into the crypt and locked the door, left her with a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and a crucifix. For 40 days, he said, as Christ in the wilderness, if your soul is pure, he will speak to you. She watched the door close, and then she smiled. because he already had. She did not wait 40 days, she waited for the moon to rise, then walked the length of the crypt, removed 3 stones, slipped into the passage and vanished. When Remy returned, the crypt was empty, the water untouched, the bread moulding, and on the wall, written in a spiral around the crucifix in soft glowing lichen, were the words, "You taught me of silence, but I learned it sings." Clemence was never seen in the village again. But in the decades that followed, strange things were whispered by candlelight, a girl who sang storms quiet, a voice heard in the woods that soothed the dying, a woman in a hooded cloak who appeared at the bedsides of the sick, humming them into peace. Father Remy died alone. His sermons lost their warmth, his eyes hollowed. And one day, the birds stopped landing on his windowsill. The house rotted, but the song did not. Sometimes in the deepest fog you can still hear it in the trees. Let that song cradle you tonight. Let the walls hum you to sleep. Let your voice return not in words but in rhythm. And know this, no matter how cold the house, no matter how stern the father, there is always a song inside the child, waiting to be sung. In the highlands of Wales, where the mountains rise like the folded hands of sleeping giants, and the valleys hold mists as old as the language itself, there once stood a grey, angular structure known as Pen Gwaed. The locals didn't call it a castle, nor a manor. Just that place. The one you didn't speak of after sunset. The one where even birds refused to land on the parapets. And at the heart of Pen Gwaed lived a man whose name was spoken only in hushed breath. Owain Feakin. Owain the Lesser, though there was nothing small about him. He was tall, gaunt, with eyes so pale they looked like mist. A noble of uncertain descent, Owain had taken the estate after a series of mysterious deaths left it without an heir. He claimed to be a cousin once removed, but the villagers said he had no cousins, only ghosts. Owain was a practitioner of law, not common law, not royal decree, but his own version. A personal code, etched into stone tablets, kept behind glass, guarded with more reverence than any altar. He believed in order above all, that children were born as wild beasts to be harnessed, and of his 3 children, only one remained under his roof. Her name was Anwen. She was born under a lunar eclipse, her first cry drowned out by thunder rolling over the cliffs. Her mother, a Breton woman of delicate voice and gentler heart, died 3 years later, slipping from a mountain path on a winter morning, her body found days later encased in ice, her hands clasped as though in prayer. Owain never spoke of her again. From that moment, Anwen was raised not as a daughter, but as a case. A series of decisions, rules, consequences. Every action she took was met with review. Every question required a written petition. She wore grey robes with numbered tags. She was assigned evaluation periods instead of birthdays. Her education was not one of reading or play, but of precedent. By the time she was 5, she could recite the Book of Domestic Codes by heart, a manuscript her father had written himself, containing laws for every hour of the day. Section 12, Article 3, all weeping must be contained within the designated weeping alcove. Section 19, Article 1, no inquiry may be made into the state of one's own affection. Section 21, Article 8, imagination is a disruption of functional routine. She did not cry. She did not laugh. She learned to breathe without being heard. But Anwen was not empty. Beneath the grey, beneath the silence, something shimmered. Not defiance. Not yet. Just observation. She noticed the cracks in the stone walls, the shift in the shadows when the moon rose, the way her father always touched his ring 3 times before speaking, the way the servants flinched not when punished but when praised. And above all, she noticed the room, the locked one. It sat at the highest tower. No name, no key, no purpose spoken. But she had seen her father enter it only once, on the anniversary of her mother's death. He stayed inside for precisely 44 minutes. When he emerged, his gloves were gone, his lips were bloodless, his hands shook. She never asked, but she remembered. At 8, Anwen began writing. Not in books, not on parchment, on the inside of her sleeves. Tiny marks, codes, questions turned into equations. Emotions expressed as weather patterns. Longing measured in rainfall. She believed that if she could translate her feelings into something logical, her father might understand them. She even left one note on his desk, folded with care, numbered and titled. Proposal for the introduction of regulated affectional exchange based on observed improvements in servant cohesion following unprompted kindness. He did not reply. But the next day, Section 31, Article 4 appeared, unauthorized emotional hypotheses are to be reported and extinguished. Still, she did not stop. She only went deeper. Beneath the estate was a maze of old tunnels, remnants of a time before Owain's law. There she found what she called the pre-logic rooms, forgotten playrooms, storerooms, servant quarters with peeling murals of suns and birds. She brought chalk. She drew. One day, while tracing an owl, she found a letter. It had been tucked inside a broken toy, a wooden lamb, split at the neck. The letter was from her mother. Not to her, but about her. If anything happens to me, and Anwen is still young, please do not let Owain raise her alone. He does not see the world, he only measures it. She will not survive within his lines. The writing was smudged, wet with time. Anwen did not sleep that night. She returned to the tunnels every day. She made maps, lists. She discovered a second staircase hidden behind the pantry, a mechanism built into the cellar door, and eventually a key. It fit the lock in the tower room. She waited until the next eclipse. It felt right. The door creaked open like it hadn't in years. Inside, not darkness but light. Candles, paintings, music sheets, a sewing kit, a book of stories written in both Breton and Welsh, and a gown. A single gown. The colour of ripe plums, her mother's room, untouched, preserved, loved. She wept for the first time in her life, and when she descended the stairs, key in hand, plum-coloured thread wrapped around her finger, her father was waiting. He said nothing. She held up the key. I found her. Still, he said nothing, but he stepped aside. That was the last time he blocked her path. Anwen left Penguide on the morning mist of spring, wearing the plum gown, barefoot. The villagers watched her walk through the valley. They say she passed without sound, but the sheep all turned to follow her, that she left a trail of moss in her wake, that her eyes glowed like stormlight. Owain lived another 10 years, alone. He never rewrote the code, never deleted the sections, but he began lighting candles in the tower every eclipse. And one day, in his ledger next to Section 1, Article 1, children are to be shaped. Someone, perhaps himself, had scribbled in small, shaking script, or understood, let the laws sleep tonight, let the ink dry. Let the child step beyond the lines, into the valley, into her own story, and may your dreams be unwritten, soft, and full of plum-coloured wind. In the parched heart of the Iberian Peninsula, where the hills turn ochre under the summer sun and the wind stirs the dust like old regrets, there once rose a fortress so square, so severe, that even the horizon seemed to flinch from its outline. Its name was Castillo de la Recta Voluntad, the Castle of Righteous Will, a place of symmetry, austerity and control. It belonged to Don Hernando de Calatrava, a nobleman whose name struck both fear and weariness into the hearts of his vassals. Don Hernando was a man of rules, but unlike others who used law as a tool or a weapon, he treated it as gospel. He believed that life was a path, narrow, straight, without bends, and that all deviation was sin. He carved this belief into stone tablets hung in the fortress's chapel. There were no sermons, only recitations. No saints, only principles. No forgiveness, only consequence. When his son Alonso was born, Hernando didn't rejoice. He didn't even hold him. He merely recorded the birth in a thick leather ledger beneath the title Asset Inheritance Log, Lineage Category B. From the moment Alonso could walk, he was put on schedule. His days began at dawn with cold water poured over his head, no matter the season. Then drills, posture correction, diction, arithmetic, Latin verse. His meals were weighed, his conversations transcribed, his movements observed by tutors who filed daily behavioural reports. He was not allowed toys, not even wooden blocks. Instead, he was given a replica of the castle in miniature, a cold, intricate model made of iron with no moving parts and no colours. This, Hernando said on Alonso's 4th birthday, is what you must become. The boy studied it, memorised it, and quietly hated it. But he said nothing, because he had already learned. Words were punished. Curiosity was a crime. Once, at 5, he asked a question, just one. Why does the sun feel different when I'm in the courtyard than when I'm on the tower? His father made him stand on the tower roof from noon until sundown, barefoot on the hot stone. When he fainted, the guards were ordered not to move him. Only when the stars appeared did Hernando carry him down. You asked, now you know. The next day, Alonso did not speak at all. From then on, silence became his armor. He learned to observe instead of ask. He watched the bees build perfect hexagons. He watched the ants form lines, break them, form new ones. He watched the falcons circle above the battlements, free in a sky where no lines existed. He began drawing in secret, tiny sketches on the backs of documents, in the margins of books, on the walls behind his bed. He drew curving roads, crumbling towers, faces with crooked smiles, and always birds. Not just as they looked, but as they might feel, weightless, defiant, unruled. He carved a small sparrow from olive wood and hid it behind a loose stone in the courtyard. Every night when no one watched, he took it out and held it to his chest. He named it Desvio, Detour. At age 10, Alonso was given his initiation of inheritance, a ceremonial reading of his duties as future lord. He stood in the great hall wearing a stiff collar, staring at the portraits of ancestors who looked more like statues than people. Don Hernando spoke for an hour, detailing laws, obligations, punishments, expectations. Alonso listened without blinking, and when it was done, his father knelt and pressed the family seal, a metal sig against the boy's wrist. "Pain," he said, "makes the memory permanent." The scar never faded. But that night, something in Alonso shifted. He returned to his chamber, took out Desvio, and stared at it in the moonlight. Then he opened the window and dropped it. The next morning, he climbed down the castle wall, barefoot. No one noticed. Not until hours later. He walked into the village, dressed in noble linens, covered in dust. The farmers stared. A baker's wife brought him bread. He thanked her. She wept. He asked the children if they had seen a wooden bird. They had not. But one girl gave him a feather. "In case you find it," she said. He stayed in the village until sundown. When he returned, he expected fury. But Don Hernando was calm. He simply took him to the cellar. There, in a small iron cage meant for hunting hounds, he locked the boy inside. "You will live here until you no longer wish to fly." 3 days passed. On the 4th, Hernando opened the cage. It was empty. No broken locks, no tunnels. Just one thing left behind, a single olive pit. He had swallowed the key, and then vanished. Some said he escaped into the Sierra, lived among shepherds. Others claimed he joined a caravan headed east, drawing for coin and speaking in riddles. A few believed he built a house with no straight walls, hidden in the desert, where wind was welcomed and no question went unanswered. But Hernando never found him. He aged, grew gaunt, bitter. He burned all the sketches he could find, tore down the portraits, even melted the iron castle model into a basin. But the real castle, Castillo de la Recta Voluntad, began to crumble, not from attack, but from silence. One by one, the stones loosened. One by one, the birds returned. Today, if you walk the ruins at dusk, you might see carvings in the exposed foundations. Spirals, wings, roads that curve into the horizon, and a tiny sparrow etched into stone. Beneath it, the words, "Not all detours are wrong turns." Tonight, may your dreams meander. May they take you off the path, into woods, into winds, into stories not written in ledgers. Let the boy fly, let the father sleep, and let the castle fall gently into sand. Far to the northeast, where the frost kisses the ground before the sun can, and the forests stretch like frozen cathedrals across the Russian steppe, there once stood a fortress of red stone and black iron. It was called Vezhlivaya Krov, the courteous blood, a name that dripped with contradiction. For while its halls were cold with civility, its roots were deep in cruelty. Its master was Boyar Mikhail Ozerov, a man renowned in the Tsar's court for his polished tongue, his elegant demeanor, and his obsessive sense of etiquette. He never raised his voice, never struck in anger, never left a meal unfinished. But behind his composure was a doctrine he never once confessed aloud, that the soul of a child could be shaped best not with violence, but with manners that bent the bones. He had 3 children, but only one remained beneath his roof past the age of 10. Yelena. She was born in a blizzard so thick, the midwives said they feared the world had ended outside. Her mother, Tatiana, was a quiet woman, once a singer in Novgorod, who died shortly after childbirth, slipping away between verses of a lullaby she never finished. Mikhail said nothing at her funeral, simply folded the final note of her song into his breast pocket and never spoke her name again. From the first day, Yelena's life was governed by formality. She was never called my child, only Miss Ozerova. She was never embraced, only nodded to. Her toys were ivory puzzles with no solution. Her bedtime stories were treatises on diplomacy. She learned to curtsy before she learned to walk. By 5, she could set a table for 40 without flaw. By 6, she greeted guests in 5 languages. But she was always alone. Mikhail did not believe in play. It invites disarray, he once told a guest, and the heart must be prepared for the world's colder rooms. Yelena grew quiet, like a lake held in ice. She smiled when expected, spoke only in complete courteous sentences, wrote thank you notes for gifts she never received. But inside she was burning. She had her mother's voice. She discovered it by accident, one morning when the snow had fallen so deep that even the servants were still. She sang to herself, softly, while brushing her hair. Just a few notes, barely more than breath. But it rang in the mirror like a secret slipping free. Mikhail heard. He stood in the doorway. "You are not a canary, Miss Ozerova," he said. "You are a lady, and ladies do not chirp." She never sang again, not aloud. But in her mind she began composing. Songs with no lyrics, just movements. Dances of sound. Notes that rose like breath held too long, then collapsed into hush. She began recording them secretly, using the pattern of her footsteps across the stone floors. 6 steps, pause, turn. 5 steps, click of heel. She memorized the rhythm of the rain, the echo of spoons, the rustle of skirts. She carried symphonies in silence. By age 9, she had mastered the violin. Mikhail allowed it, not because he loved music, but because it was formal, structured, difficult. She played for guests. They applauded. She bowed. But the songs she truly loved, she played only in the attic. There, hidden behind dust and cobwebs, was her mother's old music box. Broken. But the tune inside still lived in Yelena's memory. Each night, she would sit beside it and hum, not with voice, but with breath. One evening, she played a song she had composed herself. It was wild, strange, off-tempo. It broke rules. It trembled like spring beneath snow. Mikhail appeared without warning. He did not scold. He simply walked to the violin and snapped the bow in half. "Do not invent," he said. "You are not a composer. You are a daughter, and daughters do not improvise." That night, Yelena took the broken bow and wrapped its hair around her wrist like thread. She did not cry, but she carved something into the attic floor. Even silence makes music when listened to properly. The next morning she was gone, no signs of struggle, no footprints in the snow, only her shoes, neatly placed beside the hearth. Mikhail searched every room, asked every servant, sent riders as far as the Volga. Nothing. But a week later a letter arrived. It was unsigned. Written in a delicate, looping script. "I have left your etiquette behind, Father. I will learn to play the world the way I was never allowed to play the notes. Your ballroom is not the only stage." He burned it. Years passed, but stories began to spread, of a girl in amber robes who performed in taverns and noble houses alike, who never spoke, only played, whose melodies made grown men weep without knowing why, who never took payment, only feathers. And once, just once, someone said they saw her play a tune so strange, so beautiful, that the snow outside melted midwinter. They say Mikhail began locking all the instruments in the house, that he dined alone without music, and paced each night as if listening for a song he had once forbidden. He died with a silver fork in hand and the windows all shut. But the day of his funeral, a single violin note rang out in the square. No one saw who played it. Only a feather, white as frost, left on the chapel steps. Tonight, may you hear the music beneath your breath. May your footsteps write songs into the floor. And if the world tells you not to sing, may you hum anyway, until the snow itself stops to listen. Along the ragged coasts of the North Sea, where the wind tears through the heather like wolves through wool, and the tides drag secrets back into the deep, there once stood a stone tower on a cliff called Gallows Reach. The waves below had no rhythm. They beat the rocks like a fist against a locked door. And above them, high in that lonely tower, lived a man named Lord Cedric of Windmere, a man whose name children whispered when daring one another to enter the old churchyard after dark. Lord Cedric was not born cruel, at least not openly. In youth he had served as a naval squire and later as a captain of coastal watch. He returned from war with a limp, a hollow stare, and a ring he never wore, said to have belonged to the brother he'd left behind on the battlefield. He took his inheritance and buried himself in the tower with a new bride, Elaine of Wexmoor, and for a few years the world forgot him. Then came the child. A son, born under a storm so fierce it tore tiles from the chapel roof and split the sky into flame. His name was Ambrose. Elaine died days later, feverish and weak, her fingers curling around the hem of her husband's coat, even as he stared blankly past her into the sea. Cedric buried her without ceremony. No cross, no flowers, only a stone unmarked, cold and alone like the rest of the land. From then on, Ambrose was raised in silence. Cedric never called him son, never held him, never smiled. He treated him not as a child, but as a debt, something to be paid down through discipline. Speak less, he'd say, when the boy asked why the sky changed colours. Stand straighter when he tripped. Feel nothing when he bled. At 5, Ambrose was sent outside in the dead of winter to listen to the wind. He stood barefoot on the cliff's edge until his lips turned blue and his hands went still. When he returned, Cedric nodded. "You didn't cry," he said. "Good." The boy said nothing. Inside, Ambrose burned like the hearth he was never allowed too close to. He learned to read by sneaking into the storage room and piecing together torn pages from rotted books. He spoke to the gulls when no one listened. He whispered stories into the cracks of the stone tower, tales of ships with sails made of stars, of mothers who returned as clouds, of fathers who learned to love through loss. He built boats from driftwood and pushed them into the sea, one each month, each bearing a note to someone who might be softer. At 8, Cedric took him to the cliffs. There, beneath a twisted tree long used for hangings, stood 3 old spears, rusted, uneven. "You will learn the way of the blade," Cedric said. Ambrose picked up the smallest one. It bent slightly in his hand. Cedric struck him. "Choose strength, not sympathy." That night, Ambrose placed the spear at the foot of the old tree and whispered to it, "He doesn't know the difference." By 10, the boy no longer flinched. He learned to navigate the house like a shadow, knew which steps creaked, which windows faced away. He discovered a broken section of wall in the tower's 3rd floor, leading into an abandoned storage room filled with dust and forgotten things, old linens, sea charts, a harp missing half its strings. He stayed there often, not hiding, just breathing. One evening he found something new, a bundle of letters tied with sea blue ribbon. They were addressed to my Elaine, written in Cedric's hand. They told a different story, not of war but of guilt, not of silence but of sorrow. They spoke of a brother whose death had not been noble, but accidental, cut down by Cedric's own sword in a moment of panic. They spoke of Elaine's songs and her laughter, and how they softened the salt in the air. And they spoke of Ambrose. "He looks at me, and I see the part of myself I buried with my brother. I am afraid of him, afraid of what he might forgive." Ambrose closed the letters and stared at the harp. He plucked one string. A note rang out, cracked, uncertain, but real. He played 3 more. That night, Cedric stormed through the tower. The note had echoed. He heard it. He found the boy in the storage room. He said nothing. Ambrose held his ground. "I know," he said. "I know you're not a monster, just a man who lost the only people who let him feel." Cedric's hand trembled. He turned and walked away. Ambrose never saw him again. By dawn, the tower was empty. Only a final letter remained on the table. "The sea cannot raise sons. It can only swallow what the land casts out. Let the cliffs keep me. Let you forgive me." A pair of boots stood on the edge of the rocks. No body was found. Ambrose stayed in the tower until spring. Then he left. He took the letters, the harp, and the sea blue ribbon. He wandered the coast, then inland, where he became a storyteller. A boy with grey eyes and sea-wind hair who played music that made even the oldest soldiers weep. When asked where he came from, he would smile. "I was born in a storm," he'd say, "and I survived the silence after." Today, Gallows Reach is a ruin. But children say if you place a carved boat in the surf and whisper a story into the tide, it will carry your words to a boy who knows how to listen. And sometimes, if the wind is right, you might hear a harp string plucked from far away. Tonight, let the sea be still. Let the father drift. Let the boy speak. And may your dreams come ashore without pain, carried on small boats into gentler hands. Deep within the Bavarian woods, where the trees grow so tall and close they block out the stars, and the air is thick with pine and old prayers, there once stood a hunting lodge unlike any other. It was not large nor grand, but it sat at the heart of a clearing so silent that even wolves refused to howl there. Locals called it Der Knochenwald House, the Bonewood House. Its master was Count Eberhard Weiss, a man who spoke in sermons and moved like a shadow. He wore black even at weddings, smiled only during thunderstorms, and claimed that God had spoken to him not in a church, but in a snowstorm, through the crack of ice and the scream of wind. He had one child, a daughter, born late in life, and he named her Clara, after his mother, who had once prophesied that his bloodline would end in snow. Clara was born beneath a pale sun on the last day of autumn. She arrived with her eyes already open, her hands clenched, her cry slow and breathless like someone waking from a long dream. Her mother, Liesel, died within the hour, and the Count held the child not with awe, but with reverence, as if she were not a daughter, but a sentence passed from heaven. "She is my trial," he said, and he raised her as one. Clara's days began before dawn. At 4 years old, she was woken with cold water. At 5, she was taught to kneel in prayer for hours, no moving, no blinking, no sound. Stillness, her father would whisper, is the root of obedience. Meals were plain, always the same. Her clothing, wool, rough and grey. Her playthings, a rosary, a set of polished bones carved into animals, each representing a vice, he claimed, that she must learn to resist. She was not allowed mirrors. He said vanity would steal her soul. But Clara watched herself in puddles, in candle wax, in the shine of the iron bell by the chapel. She knew her face, pale, freckled, with a mouth that ached to laugh. She never did, not because she couldn't, but because no one had ever shown her how. She learned to read by deciphering the books in her father's library. Not fairy tales, but confessionals, books of martyrs, writings by desert monks, pages so dry and cracked they seemed to crumble with guilt. Still she read, and she began to write. Not words, not letters, but drawings, symbols. Tiny sketches pressed into the inside of her sleeves with ash or needlepoint. A bird in a cage. A girl with no mouth. A ladder that reached past the moon. When her father found one, he tore the sleeve away and burned it in front of her. "You are not made for dreaming," he said. "You are made for salvation." She nodded, but inside a secret bloomed like frost on a window pane. Clara began to speak to the woods, not aloud, never aloud, but in breath, in footsteps, in silence. She would walk through the bone-thin trees, barefoot, even in snow, and press her palms to the bark of old firs. She gave them names, told them stories, traced prayers in the snow that made no mention of fire or sin, and one night the woods answered. She had wandered further than usual to a place her father forbade. A stone well sat there, ancient and sealed, around it broken statues of saints, faces weathered off, hands missing, heads bowed. She knelt beside it, whispered a name she had never heard before, and felt something stir beneath the soil. Not evil, not holy, just awake. From then on she returned each night, and each morning she woke knowing things she had never read, languages, songs, histories not written in any book. She saw faces in her dreams, gentle, sorrowful, watching. The Count noticed. She had begun to walk differently, speak with calm, uncanny certainty. Her hands no longer trembled during confession, and once, when he struck her for humming, she simply looked at him, with pity. That night he dragged her to the chapel, forced her to kneel, lit candles until the room sweltered, and recited line by line the entire sermon of St. Huldrych, his voice growing hoarse, desperate. When he finished, Clara stood. "You are afraid of the wrong God," she said softly. He slapped her, and for the first time she smiled. He locked her in the root cellar beneath the lodge. No light, no food, only the smell of damp wood and old meat hooks. "You will stay," he shouted through the door, "until the darkness takes your pride." But when he returned 3 days later, the door was open. No lock broken, no bars moved, just a trail of pine needles leading into the woods, and one of the bone-carved animals, shattered. A bird, its wings snapped clean off. She was never seen again. Some say she became a spirit of the forest, appearing to lost children with a crown of frost and eyes like moonlight. Others say she crossed into another world, one ruled not by fire or thorns, but by stillness that loved rather than judged. Eberhard wandered the woods until his death. He was found curled beside the old well, muttering her name to the roots. Clara, Clara, Clara. No tomb was built, no prayers were said. But in the forest, beneath the snow, the trees leaned slightly inward now, as if listening, as if bowing. Let the trees guard you tonight. Let the snow be soft. Let the silence be kind. And may the girl who named the woods remember your dreams like a lullaby pressed into ash. Sleep gently. The forest is watching, with love. In the golden dust of Anatolia, where the sun seems to hang lower in the sky and the mountains curl like sleeping beasts across the horizon, there once stood a manor carved from ochre stone, nestled among olive groves and cracked earth. It was called Evsesislik, the House of Stillness. No laughter ever echoed from its walls, no songs from its windows. Only the shuffle of sandals, the faint scent of ink and incense, and the quiet breathing of its master, Emir Halil al-Turan. Halil was a scholar, a mystic, a man of scrolls and silence. He had studied with poets, dined with sultans, and fasted alone in the desert for 40 days in pursuit of the perfect inward. But when his first and only child was born, a boy named Sem, he believed that the divine had given him a vessel, not for love, but for perfection. Children are not gifts, he once wrote in the margins of his manuscripts. They are mirrors. Polish them until they shine like truth. Sem was born beneath a blood moon. His mother, Zeynep, a gentle woman who loved music and dried figs, died hours after delivering him. Her final words were simply, "Let him be soft." Halil heard but did not listen. Sem's earliest memories were of ink, rows of letters he couldn't yet understand, symbols that danced across parchment like ants in formation. He was taught to write before he was taught to speak. Words came not from lips, but from the reed pen. When he cried as a toddler, Halil would place a quill in his tiny hand and say, "Describe the ache," or silence it. He was not punished with hands, only with omission. Praise was a rare currency, affection a myth. Sem learned early that attention came only when he excelled, and so he did. At 5, he recited verses from Jalal al-Din Rumi. At 6, he could copy entire texts in flawless calligraphy. At 7, he could sit for hours without movement, like a statue in his father's study. But at night, he whispered stories to the shadows. They weren't poems or philosophies. They were little things. A bird who couldn't stop sneezing, a donkey who wanted to be a fisherman, a river who got lost on its way to the sea. He drew them clumsily in the corners of discarded parchment, hid them in the cracks between the floor tiles, buried them beneath stone pots and tucked them behind old books. And sometimes, just sometimes, he laughed. Once, Halil heard. It was a soft giggle, barely more than breath, when a lizard leapt onto Sem's ink bottle and slipped, splattering a black sun across the page. Halil stood in the doorway. "You waste your mind," he said. That night, Sem's writing desk was taken away, replaced with a single cushion, a single scroll, and a silence so complete he could hear his own heart ticking like a clock. At 10, he began fasting not out of faith, but to feel something. And yet, something inside him remained, unfolding, petal by petal. He met a girl in the olive grove. She was the daughter of a wandering merchant, there with her family for only a fortnight. Her name was Layla. She carried a satchel full of stones she had named, and she wore her braids like question marks. She found Sem in the trees, tracing lines in the dust with a stick. "What are you drawing?" she asked. "I don't know," he replied. Maybe a thought that got lost. She smiled. They met every morning after that, before the heat grew too cruel. She taught him how to skip stones. He taught her how to write her name in calligraphy. She told him stories about a cloud that cried raisins. He told her about the donkey who became a fisherman. It was the happiest Sem had ever been. Until Halil found the satchel of named stones. He summoned Sem to the courtyard, said nothing, simply poured the stones out one by one onto the tile and crushed them underfoot. When the last stone cracked, he whispered, "You are not to carry someone else's noise." Layla's family left the next day. Sem didn't cry, but he stopped speaking for 7 months. Halil called it progress. He wrote in his journal, "The child is learning restraint, perhaps silence is finally taking root." But in truth, the silence was blooming. Sem began to write again, but in secret, on olive leaves, on broken bits of tile, on the walls of the unused bathhouse, in symbols only he could read. He invented an alphabet of wind and branches, rain and feather. He composed a language no one else spoke, and through it told stories no one else could erase. Then one night, when the stars shivered in the sky and even the owls forgot to call, Sem stood in the centre of the courtyard and began to hum. Not loud, not for anyone, just for himself. Halil woke and watched from behind a lattice screen. His hands trembled, his breath caught. He wanted to stop him, but he didn't. The next morning, Sem was gone. No sandals missing, no doors broken, only a trail of parchment leaves scattered like petals in the wind. Each one bore a word. Together they read, "Softness is not weakness, it is wind through stone." Halil searched, but found nothing. Years later, stories began to ripple across the bazaars and caravan roads, of a boy with quiet eyes who spoke strange languages to animals, who wrote verses on bark and water, who healed sadness with whispered metaphors. They called him the scribe of the trees. No one knew where he came from. But once, in the shade of a distant fig orchard, a girl found a leaf with her name written on it in perfect calligraphy, curving, playful, like a smile. She picked it up and whispered, "Sem, let the olive trees guard your sleep tonight. Let ink become song. And may the stories you whisper into silence bloom in someone's memory, long after you've gone. Rest now. The wind is listening." At the edge of a crumbling aqueduct in Lazio, where the fields roll golden beneath skies the colour of old vellum, and the cypresses stand like solemn witnesses to centuries of secrets, there once stood a villa with walls painted the hue of dried roses. They called it Villa Silente, the silent villa, and no name had ever fit a place more precisely. It belonged to Marcus Severinus, a patrician of fading wealth and firm conviction. In his youth, he had served as an advisor to local magistrates, crafting policies, reciting Cicero, and quoting Stoic maxims with a mouth dry as sand. He believed in reason, in hierarchy, and above all in the extinguishing of emotion as the path to personal order. He called love a tempest and grief a distraction. He wrote essays on the virtue of detachment, and he practiced what he preached. Perhaps too well. He had one son, Tullius. Born under a pale spring sun, Tullius was a quiet infant with a strange gaze, far away as though already listening to music others couldn't hear. His mother, Livia, was a painter, though her works never left the villa. Her canvases were full of dream things, trees with wings, rivers bending upward, faces with no mouths. She whispered stories into her son's ears even before he could sit upright. She told him about birds that lived in shadows and stars that fell into fountains. Marcus disapproved. She died when Tullius was 4. Consumption, they said. After her passing, all of her paintings were removed, not burned, just hidden, locked in the old servant's wing. Her name was never spoken again, and from that day Tullius was raised alone. Marcus saw no need for other tutors. "He has my books," he said, "and books do not lie." Tullius studied every day in silence. Latin, Greek, logic, history. Meals were taken without conversation. The rules of the household were carved into wood and hung in every hallway. 1. Speak only when necessary. 2. Emotion is indulgence. 3. Reflection is permitted. Imagination is not. 4. Do not open locked doors. But Tullius remembered. He remembered the warmth of Livia's voice, even if her words were fading. He remembered the smell of paint, the flutter of canvas in the sunlit room near the east garden. He remembered the way her fingers moved in the air, drawing invisible spirals when she thought no one watched. And he remembered the laughter, rare, fragile, but real. By the time he turned 7, he had memorized every phrase his father valued. He quoted Aurelius with perfect inflection. He recited logic puzzles without pause. He walked without sound, and Marcus nodded, satisfied. But when he was alone, Tullius did something dangerous. He imagined. He drew with charcoal stolen from the fireplace, on old napkins, on the underside of tables, on the inside of cupboard doors. Nothing extravagant, just fragments. A flower with too many petals, a man with a fish for a heart, a boy floating above a field of closed eyes. One day, while dusting an unused corridor, he found a crack in the wall. A breeze whispered through it. It led to the servant's wing, sealed since his mother's death. He waited until midnight. Then, barefoot, he returned with a candle and a key he had carved from soft wood. It broke in the lock, but the door opened anyway. Inside, the dust was thick, but the paintings were there, dozens of them, unmoved, untouched. His mother's world, unforgotten. He sat there for hours, maybe longer, tracing the brushstrokes with his fingers, breathing the memory of her, and then he saw it, a final painting, unfinished, hidden beneath a cloth. It was of him, not as he was, but as he might be. Eyes open, arms raised, a bird flying from his chest. In the lower corner, in fading red, the words, "He will be my echo," not his silence. That night he returned to his room and didn't sleep. He began painting again, in secret, not like his mother. He didn't have colours, only soot, ash, dust. But it was enough. He painted on stone, on bark, on leaves, and on one particular night he painted on the inside of the villa's main door, a boy stepping through a frame into a world made of wind. Marcus found it. He summoned Tullius, did not shout, did not strike, only said, "You are ashamed of discipline." Tullius looked up and answered, "No, I am only done mistaking it for love." And he turned and walked out of the villa. No one followed. He was 10. For many years, Villa Silente remained silent indeed. Marcus lived and aged in solitude, surrounded by quotes he could recite but never feel. Occasionally he burned one of Livia's canvases, but he never touched the one of the boy with the bird. And then one morning, a knock at the door. When the old servant opened it, she found nothing but a single feather, painted, pinned to a slip of paper. It read, "I remember how to laugh now." Tullius was never seen again. But stories drifted through the valleys of a young man who painted murals on the walls of abandoned wells, of poems hidden beneath bridges, of feathers tucked into the pages of borrowed books. They said he spoke softly, smiled often, and painted not for fame, but for those who had forgotten their own dreams. Let the paints dry tonight. Let the silence fold itself around you like soft canvas, and may you remember the touch of a hand that once taught you colour. Sleep well, child of brush and ash. The door is still open. Walk through. High in the Carpathian mountains, where the clouds hang low like damp curtains, and the pines grow so dense they hush even the howling wind, there once loomed a manor of black stone called Castellul Umbrae, the Castle of Shadow. Perched on a cliff above a river that never thawed, it had no visible path leading to its gates. Only those brought there by blood ever found their way back. Within its cold halls lived Count Serban Dragici, a man known to the peasants only through rumour and silhouette. They called him Domnul Taceri, the Lord of Silence. A noble descended from an ancient line, Serban had long renounced the affairs of men. He kept no court, hosted no feasts. He believed the world was corrupt, its noise a sickness. His only legacy, he insisted, would be a perfect heir, untainted, untouched, unspeaking. That heir was his son, Andrei. Andrei was born under a lunar eclipse, in a tower chamber lit by candlelight and watched only by ravens. His mother, Sophia, did not survive the birth. The official word was hemorrhage, but the midwife, who was dismissed the next day, swore the count never allowed her to scream. "Let him enter into quiet," Serban had said. "Let no wailing follow him." And so silence became Andrei's cradle. He was raised without song, without lullaby, without the laughter of children. The servants were forbidden to speak in his presence. Books were stripped of dialogue. Toys were shaped from smooth stone and bore no faces. Mirrors were covered, curtains drawn. Each morning the boy was led to the northern tower, where his father waited in a chair facing the window. Andrei would kneel, place his hand over his heart, and receive the daily verse. One sentence. Always from the same book. Codex Umbrae, a leather-bound volume Serban claimed was older than Christendom. Its teachings were cryptic, poetic in their austerity. Truth is a shadow that vanishes when stared at directly. The tongue is the gatekeeper of ruin. Stillness is closer to God than breath. Andrei memorized them all. By age 7, he had not spoken a full sentence, but his eyes were alive. They wandered the cracks in the floor, traced the outlines of birds overhead, followed the flicker of candlelight across the high, vaulted ceilings. And though no one taught him art, he began to draw. He etched shapes into the frost on his window, scratched lines into the underside of his desk. Symbols, spirals, wings, sometimes eyes without faces. One day, in the manor's abandoned east wing, he found a locked door. It had no handle, only a carving of a tree with roots like claws. Above it, faintly etched, was the phrase, "The Room of Forbidden Echoes." He returned nightly, pressing his ear against the stone, listening, and eventually the door opened. Not with a key, not with force, but with presence. Inside was a room full of voices, not shouting, not screaming, just soft echoes. Some in Latin, some in Old Romanian, some in tongues that had never known ink. They floated like dust motes, caught in currents unseen. And in the centre, a mirror, uncovered. Andrei looked into it. He saw himself, not as he was, but as he might have been. Laughter curled in the corners of his imagined mouth, and then a sound escaped him, barely more than breath. But it was a voice, his own, and the castle trembled, not with violence, but awakening. Walls groaned, candles flared, the shadows seemed to pulse. Count Serban felt it. He rushed to the wing, fury in his chest, Codex Umbrae in his hand. He found the boy standing in the echoing chamber, smiling. "You have broken the silence," Serban said, voice low with thunder. "You have shattered the line." Andrei turned. "No," he said softly, "I have made it sing." His voice echoed once, then twice, then multiplied, as though the walls themselves had waited years to remember how. Serban stepped forward, raised the codex to strike, but the floor beneath him cracked. The roots of the carved tree broke through stone, curling like fingers, and in a moment he was gone, swallowed not by death but by the very silence he had worshipped. The book fell shut beside him. Andrei left the room, left the castle. No one saw where he went. But shepherds told of a boy who wandered the mountains humming lullabies older than the hills, who etched songs into trees and left notes in the shape of spirals on the stones of forgotten roads. And in the ruins of Castellul Umbrae, birds returned. They nested in the towers, and when they sang, their songs echoed longer than they should, as if the walls were still listening, still learning. Still remembering the boy who taught them that silence is not the absence of voice, but the place where the soul prepares to speak. Tonight, may your words find soft landing. May the quiet around you feel like a friend, not a cage. And if you listen closely, you might just hear the echoes waiting to become yours. In the salt-bitten hills of Cornwall, where the cliffs lean into the sea as if weary from watching centuries roll past in waves, there stood a manor built from dark granite and superstition. It was called Wraith Hollow, and though it was no more than 3 stories high, its presence loomed over the coast like a question no one dared answer. The locals said the manor breathed at night, that its shutters clattered in windless dark, and that its chimneys whispered old names when the tide was low. They also said its master, Lord Alaric Penrith, had long ago traded his soul for silence, and that his son Thomas was the payment still walking. Alaric was a man of iron and scripture, a former preacher turned recluse. He had renounced the pulpit after claiming that no church was clean enough for truth. He filled his halls with relics, not of saints but of silence. A monk's cracked jawbone, a shrouded mirror, a stone slab marked with the word still in 17 languages. He believed the world had been too loud since Eden, and he was determined that his legacy would whisper, not roar. Thomas was born during a fog so thick that even the lighthouse went blind. The midwife, a nervous woman from the village, insisted the child didn't cry when he emerged, only opened his eyes, wide and searching. Alaric took this as divine confirmation. A boy who knows silence before sound will never be ruled by noise. He raised the child not as a boy, but as a ritual. Thomas was not allowed music, not even the rhythm of a spoon against a bowl. He was fed with cloth-wrapped utensils, walked barefoot on moss to soften his steps, and was taught to blink in patterns to communicate rather than speak. Each word spoken aloud had to be earned through fasting, kneeling, or prayer. By age 6, he had spoken no more than 20 sentences in his life. Alaric tracked each one in a ledger. The servants avoided him, not because he was cruel, but because the silence clung to him like a second skin. He passed through halls like a shadow. He never ran, never played. He folded his clothes with precision and bowed to his father every morning, hand over heart, lips unmoving. But inside, Thomas was awake. He kept secrets, not spoken but stored. In cracks between the wall stones, he hid drawings, not of faces, but of movement. Birds mid-flight, waves mid-crash, branches mid-bend. He would crouch beneath the staircase for hours, just to listen to the creak of the wood, the whisper of the sea beyond the cliffs. He began crafting tiny wind chimes from shells and thread, hanging them in the trees just beyond the reach of the manor grounds. He never touched them, never watched them sway. But he imagined their song, and in the quiet, his heart kept time. At age 10, Alaric initiated the silence rite. It was a family ritual, he claimed, though no record of it existed. The boy was to spend 7 nights and 7 days in the chapel below the manor, sealed in solitude, fasting and meditating. No light, no water, no voice. It is how the voice learns to become truth, Alaric said. Thomas bowed. He entered the chapel. The doors shut and silence fell. The first day he counted his breaths. The second, he listened to the groaning of the stone. The third, he began to hum, softly, silently, in his throat without opening his lips. By the 5th day, something stirred behind the altar. Not danger, Not salvation. A memory. A fragment. He reached behind the tapestry and found a hidden panel. Inside, a box. Inside the box, a notebook wrapped in worn velvet. It belonged to his mother. He had never known her. Alaric never spoke her name, only that she succumbed to the chaos of the world. But here was her voice, etched in ink. He wants a boy of silence, but our child is music. I sang to you in the womb, even if you don't remember, your bones do. One day I hope you find sound again, and when you do, don't be afraid to shout. The boy wept, quietly, and then slowly, deliberately, he stood and sang. It wasn't perfect, it cracked, it wavered, but it filled the chapel like dawn. When the seventh night ended, the chapel door opened. Alaric stood, hands folded. Thomas emerged, silent, calm. Holding the notebook, he said nothing. He handed it to his father. Alaric opened it, read, paused, and for the first time looked afraid. Thomas walked past him, up the stairs, out the manor door, into the wind, and from the trees beyond the grounds, the wind chimes began to ring. Alaric followed. He stood beneath them, trembling. The shells sang softly, high, wild, uneven. He fell to his knees. Thomas did not return. But those who walk the coast say they sometimes see a young man in a cloak of dark seaweed and gull feathers, listening to the ocean, scribbling in a worn velvet book, his voice like the tide, gentle, persistent, inevitable. And when the wind blows just right, the manor groans with its own awakening, as if remembering how to speak. Tonight, may your silence make space for your song. May your breath be your first instrument. And may you walk free from the places that feared your voice. Sleep, gentle listener, and dream in wind chimes. On the mist-swept plains of the Hungarian lowlands, where reeds whisper beside still waters and the sky stretches wide like a faded canvas, there once stood a wooden estate called Sailhaza, the House of Wind. Built beside a great marsh that reflected the moon too clearly, it was a place that held itself still, as though bracing for news it hoped would never come. And in that place lived a man who valued lineage more than life itself. His name was István Tansos, and he traced his bloodline back 9 generations, each carefully documented in his Aronikoni, the Golden Book, bound in calfskin and kept beneath lock and candle. A widower, a war veteran, and a man possessed by legacy, István saw himself not as a father, but as the final steward of a sacred chain. His every breath was spent ensuring it would not break with him. That duty fell to his daughter. Her name was Katalin. She was born in the dead of winter, as sleet swept the plains and wolves circled unseen beyond the tree line. Her mother, Margit, died giving birth to her twin, a boy who lived only long enough to draw breath and turn his head toward the fireplace before going still. István buried the boy with a name already chosen, Miklos. Katalin he named only weeks later, once he had reconciled with her failure to be what he needed. A daughter, he told the midwife flatly, is a branch, not a trunk. From the moment she could walk, Katalin was trained to serve the legacy of the house. She was taught to stand beside portraits of dead men and recite their deeds. She was forbidden to write fiction or dance or spend time in the sun. Fading skin is fading worth, her father once muttered. She memorized the family tree before she memorized her own birthday. Each morning began with inspection. Hair, posture, shoes. If she failed, if even a single braid was out of place, István would remove the candle from her room for the night. She feared the dark. He said that was good. Fear, he told her, is the root of discipline, and discipline is the root of tradition. At 8, she found the portraits unbearable. She had to walk the gallery daily, reciting names and dates. Gabor the Just, Levente the Blessed, Aaron the Scribe, Vilmos the Wolf Slayer. Dozens, always men, always looking down. Their frames were thick with guilt and dust, their eyes painted too sharply. She began to see them move, not in anger, in disappointment. So she did what children do when trapped between obedience and dread. She began to imagine, not loudly, not in rebellion, but in whispers. She gave each portrait a second name, secret names. Gabor became the one who wished he'd run. Levente became the man who feared the rain. Vilmos, who wore a sword in his painting, she renamed the boy who broke the blade and never told. She sketched these hidden lives into the back of her almanac, using a needle and soot to avoid detection. At 10, she was told her purpose, to marry. Not yet, but soon. A nobleman's son, a few years her senior, whose family shared ancestral blood. It will restore the branch to strength, her father said. She did not argue. But that night, she took the golden book. She did not burn it. She did not tear it. She read it. All of it. And discovered something strange. There were gaps, years missing, a generation mislabeled, a child's name scratched out. In the oldest pages, written in a different hand, she found a single note in the margin. They will forget her, but I will not. She copied the note onto a piece of lace and sewed it into the hem of her dress. That was the first night she slept without a candle, and it was not so frightening after all. At 12, the betrothal was announced. Guests came. Toasts were made. She wore a blue ribbon and smiled the way she'd been taught. But the next morning, her bed was empty. Only a feather remained on the pillow, and a trail of footprints led into the marsh. Istvan searched for weeks, sent riders, bribed hunters, questioned every fisherman along the Danube. Nothing, only reeds and wind. But stories began to surface, of a girl who wandered from village to village, barefoot, carrying no name, who listened to family stories and wrote them in a book she never opened twice, who taught daughters how to rename their ancestors, who lit candles for women who had none. Some said she whispered to portraits. Some said the portraits whispered back, and in time the manor began to rot. The portraits faded, the golden book disappeared, and Istvan, old and blind, sat alone in the gallery, reciting names that no longer answered. One servant, passing his door, claimed to hear him mumbling, "She is the one who remembers me kindly, and she should not. Let the branches grow where they will tonight. Let your name be yours. Let the silence of old houses become the lullaby of those who escaped them. Sleep now and dream not of legacies, but of lace and marshes and girls who name the wind." Beneath the heavy mists of the black forest, where even the sunlight seemed to hesitate, and the trees leaned too close as if guarding secrets older than scripture, there stood a crooked estate called Blutstein House, the House of Bloodstone. It earned its name from the deep red veins that streaked through its foundation rock, a mineral said to weep when rain touched it. Travellers avoided the path that led there. Birds avoided its chimneys, and inside it, for more years than anyone cared to count, lived Dr. Nikolaus Ferber. He was not a noble, not a warrior, not a clergyman. He was a physician, a scholar of anatomy, a collector of silence, and a father. He had a daughter named Sabine, born not of love but of design. Nikolaus believed the human body to be a puzzle, a sacred clockwork. He had studied in Heidelberg, dissected cadavers in Paris, and lectured briefly in Vienna before returning to the forest to pursue his own theories. Chief among them, that emotion was a chemical imbalance, and that a child raised free from such imbalances could become a perfect being. Sabine's mother, a pianist of remarkable tenderness, had died 2 weeks after childbirth. Some say it was fever, others say it was despair. Nikolaus never spoke her name again. He kept no portrait of her, only her metronome. And each morning, Sabine was awakened by its ticking. Her childhood was measured in rhythm, not music, not stories, not lullabies, but patterns, pulse rates, breathing intervals, repetitions of movement. By age 5, she could recite the bones of the body in Latin. By 6, she had been taught to stitch a wound on a pig's foot. By 7, she could measure the tension of a tendon by touch alone. She was never hugged, never praised, only corrected, only recorded. Each week, Nikolaus tested her, reflex speed, temperature tolerance, muscle fatigue. He did not punish, he observed. If she failed, he made her repeat the test. If she passed, he raised the standard. In the laboratory below the house, she had her own cot. Not a bed, a cot. Beside the jars of preserved specimens, beside the tools lined in velvet. But Sabine was not empty. She was precise. She spoke softly, rarely, but always clearly. Her movements were graceful, deliberate, and she had one habit her father never understood. She watched the birds. There was a window in the laboratory, narrow, grimed with years of dust, but through it she could see the branches of a single pine tree, and in that tree each morning came the same crow. She called him Schwartz. She never spoke the name aloud. She tapped it in rhythm against the iron table, a code, her language, hers alone. And in time she began writing, not in her father's notebooks, in her own. She recorded dreams, not of flying, but of weightlessness, of floating in warm water, of silence that was not imposed but chosen. She drew the crow, over and over, each time with more detail. Not just wings, but eyes, not just feathers, but expression. One day her father noticed the drawings. He did not scold her. He placed a scalpel on the table and said, "You will dissect the next crow you see. Observe the limitations of the wing. Dispel the illusion." She looked at him and said quietly, "No." It was the first time she had refused. Nicolaus said nothing. That night she was locked in the storage chamber. No light, no cot, only jars and ticking. The metronome. He placed it outside the door, let it echo through the crack in the wood. Click, click, click. She sat in the dark and began to tap her own rhythm against the floor, a slower one, softer, not resistance, not defiance, a separate music. When the door opened the next morning, she was gone. The window was broken. The crow was waiting outside. Nicolaus searched the woods. He never found her. But over the years, hunters and woodcutters began to whisper of a girl who lived in the forest. She wore a coat of black feathers. She moved like wind over still water, and she carried a notebook. When children went missing, she returned them. When the sick wandered too far, she guided them home. Some said she never spoke. Others said she sang in a voice that stopped pain. Back in Blutstein House, the metronome slowed. Tick, 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 until one day it stopped. Nicolaus died beside it, not from age, not from disease, but from stillness. No one claimed the body. But years later, a physician's journal was found in a ruin by the river, its pages covered in notes, formulas, and one final entry, written in a shaking hand. "I sought perfection. I created something free instead. Let the ticking fall away tonight. Let the rhythm be yours. Let the lab be quiet and the birds return to your windowsill. And may the silence you carry into sleep tonight be chosen, not caged. The crow is watching, and the girl is flying." In the wind-scoured reaches of the Scottish Isles, where the sea speaks in groans and gulls circle like forgotten thoughts, there stood a ruin on a rocky bluff, known only as Seatas Crithe, justice of the heart. The name was older than memory, carved into weather-worn stone above a door that no longer stood. The locals said no roof stayed on that place longer than a year, that the wind tore them off not in storms, but in calm. That something inside didn't want to be covered. The land once belonged to Laird Duncan MacIver, a man whose name was still spoken in warnings and superstitions, not because of war, not because of wealth, but because of how he treated his sons. He had 5. But this story is about the 4th. Callum. Duncan believed in hierarchy, in dominion, in the shaping of men through cold, through hunger, through deprivation. He claimed that love was a lie told by the weak to excuse softness, that a father's duty was not to nurture, but to forge. He said this often, over the bones of meals no one enjoyed. Each boy was given a name, then stripped of it, until they earned it back. Callum lost his name at 3 for crying when a sheep died in his arms. He was called 4th for the next 6 years. They were not raised with affection. They were raised with tasks, cutting peat, mending nets, holding their breath in freezing water, carrying stones up hills and back again just to learn the meaning of burden. Duncan watched with arms crossed. Any word of protest was met with silence, or a walk into the moor where you were left to find your way back with no cloak. Callum didn't speak much, but he watched. He saw the eldest become cruel, the second become hollow, the third begin to flinch at shadows. The 5th, still a babe, was kept away, barely spoken of. Their mother had died when Callum was 4. No one spoke her name either. There was no portrait. Only a chair she used to sit in, now empty and covered in dust. At night, Callum would sneak into the ruined chapel beside the bluff. It was half collapsed, with no roof and only one remaining wall, the one that held the altar. There he spoke. Not prayers, just words. Simple ones. Kind ones. He whispered the names of the sheep he tended, the birds he'd seen that day, the shapes of clouds he imagined as ships or giants or bowls of stew, and sometimes he whispered his own name. Callum, just to remember it. He started carving small things out of driftwood, shapes with no purpose. A spiral, a feather, a hand. He hid them in the chapel wall in a hollow beneath the altar. A shrine, maybe. Or a secret. One day Duncan found them. He said nothing, just threw them all into the sea. That night, Callum did not sleep. He walked barefoot to the top of the bluff, sat there until dawn, and in the morning he returned to the hall and said, "You don't know how to build anything, only how to break." Duncan struck him, then turned and walked away. Callum left that same day. No horse, no pack, just the clothes on his back and a single carving he'd remade in secret, a wave curling into itself. Years passed. The hall decayed. The brothers went their ways. Some into war, some into drink, some into disappearance. But stories began to grow in the cracks between places, of a quiet man who mended boats without asking for coin, who carved names into oars, not for ownership but remembrance, who taught children how to speak to trees and listen to cliffs, who rebuilt ruined places with his bare hands and left without waiting for thanks. They said he never raised his voice, but when he spoke, people listened. And one day, Seatas Cree, the broken ruin on the bluff, stood tall again, not in stone but in wood, a small shelter, a fire pit, a bench carved with dozens of names, none of them Duncan's. Callum never returned to the hall, but he returned to the chapel. He rebuilt its altar, and beneath it he placed a single carving, his name, nothing more. When Duncan died, no one came for the body. The wind took it, but Callum sang that night, not loudly, just to the sea, a song with no words. Just the sound of someone remembering that they were not made to carry silence alone. Tonight, let the wind pass gently. Let the cliff remember you with kindness. And if someone ever took your name, may it return to you in sleep, soft as driftwood, carved with care and yours alone. At the edge of the world, or so it seemed to those who lived beyond its borders, there stood a stone monastery clinging to the cliffs of Iceland's western fjords. Its name was Kaldak Vissel, the cold vein, and it was less a house of God than a vault for silence. The sea below was black and bottomless, and the wind never ceased its long, mournful cry. Yet inside the monastery it was quieter still. The monks there were nameless, faceless beneath thick wool hoods, and bound by a vow not just of silence, but of absence. They did not speak. They did not look one another in the eye. They walked in single file and burned their own letters. Their god, they said, lived in the spaces between breaths. Among them was a man who was not truly a monk. He was not shaved, nor initiated, nor accepted. He had arrived 20 years ago, with no name, no possessions, and a child in his arms. He never spoke. They allowed him to stay. The child was called Elise. She grew up without a mother, without a village, without even the echoes of other children's voices. Her lullabies were the scrape of sand against stone, the drip of water from stalactites, and the ever-present hiss of wind through slits in the rock. Her toys were bones, sea glass, broken bits of sculpture from ruins long buried beneath ash and snow. Her father, if that's what he was, never explained why he had brought her there. He taught her not by words but by ritual. They walked the cliffs together in silence. He showed her where the puffins nested, how to catch their shadow rather than their wing. He placed stones in circles and taught her to watch which ones shifted when the tides changed. He showed her the stars, not as names or stories, but as directions. And when she cried, he simply placed her hand on his chest until her breathing matched his. She loved him, in the quiet way children do when they know no other world. But as she grew older, the silence changed. It became heavy, tight around her throat. She began to draw in secret. Charcoal on cave walls, faces, mouths open mid-song, women with wings, men with broken chains. She didn't know where the images came from, only that they burned in her fingers until released. And one night she found a book. It had been hidden beneath the sleeping mat in her father's cell, bound in seal leather, pages covered in a language she didn't know, but recognized. On the final page was a sketch of a woman, her eyes full of sorrow, her hair loose and wild. Beside her, a cradle made of driftwood, and beneath it, a single name. Elise. She carried the book with her for days, waiting. But he never looked at her, never spoke, never even acknowledged the change. So she did. She stood before him in the chapel of salt-stained stone, opened the book and pointed to the name, and whispered, "Why?" He flinched, but said nothing. So she left. The next morning, she was gone. Down the cliffside trail, only the monks used to cast fish bones into the sea. She walked until her feet bled, and then further, into the world. And the world, strange as it was, did not frighten her. She listened before she spoke, watched before she touched. She learned languages quickly, spoken and unspoken, learned names like songs and faces like maps. And soon, people began to follow her. Not for miracles, but for stillness. They said she could hear the pain you didn't speak, that she could quiet the noise behind your eyes, that when she hummed, just barely, you remembered the sound of your mother's breath as she first held you. No one knew her story. But once in a seaside village far south, someone found a seal leather book left beside a sleeping child. Inside it, a new final page. A sketch of a man with sad eyes standing on a cliff. Behind him, the wind. Before him, a girl walking away, head held high towards stars. Above it, in gentle ink, "You never spoke, but I heard you anyway. Now I carry both our voices." Back at Kaldek-Vissel, the man, old now, bent, stood each evening on the cliff. He never called her name, but the wind did. And some say on clear nights, the sea below hums, a lullaby without words. Tonight, let the silence around you feel like arms. Let it hold, not smother. Let it listen. Let it remember. And when you wake, may you speak freely, knowing someone somewhere once carried your quiet and made it sing. Sleep now. The world is listening.